But this is my idea of what we should talk about today as a starting point. I wanted to first throw up a brief map and description of the entire Appalachian mountain chain and ridge system for those not familiar with it, and show how Fairfield relates to that. Talk about some of the, I call global, or the big picture view of the ridge and mountain system. Then talk a bit about forecasting, weather forecasting, how we forecast and what we look for in terms of wave and ridge flying out of Fairfield. And then Dave will be giving about a 30-minute introduction to ridge flying. And I think about probably half the people here are not ridge flyers, but would like to be. So it'd be a great session for them. I'm going to talk a little bit about wave flying, building on top of Dave's presentation on ridge flying. Then go into some tasks and routes and methods for starting and ending and planning big tasks out of Fairfield. And then if we have time, I can go into some considerations and slides on preparing yourself and your glider for long duration flights and cold weather flying. And then back in April of last year, Paul Ream and I flew a really nice long flight out of Fairfield, and I've got some slides and stuff to present on that if we have time and if there is interest. And then we can go on to just other general discussions and so forth. Notice that I brought the raised relief mat behind me. That's been stuck in my basement in the loft of my barn for a long time, and I drug it out and taped it back together and brought it over. But we can use that to point and talk to as well, because that doesn't show the entire ridge system, but it shows 90% of where we fly to out of Fairfield. Sound good? Is audio okay? You got everything? Okay. As you can see, Jeff is videotaping this, and I think the intent is to put this up on the website or make it available to those who missed the session today. Okay, well, interrupt me anytime if you have questions. Let's get started. This is the entire ridge system, the Appalachian Ridge system. You see Fairfield marked there. We're sitting there today, and you see all the major ridges highlighted around the system. Let me get my laser pointer working here. The main ridge, the one furthest northwest, is right here, all the way from Tazewell to Williamsport. Behind that are a series of back ridges. Now, there are a lot more ridges that are flyable and are commonly flown that aren't marked here, but these are the major ridges, the ridges that are maybe 30 miles or more in length, and the ones used as routes to go on long tasks. Notice down here in the lower southwest corner, I've got this dashed line going down toward Knoxville from Tazewell. That is the extended southern end of the ridge. I have never flown it, and it's kind of outside the scope of what I'd like to talk about today because it is not commonly flown. But guys can take off from Williamsport or up here in central Pennsylvania and fly all the way down to Knoxville and basically stay on what's called the main ridge that whole time. To give you a feeling for the scope of it, from Williamsport, which anchors the north end, down to Tazewell, which anchors the south end of the main ridge, it's 375 miles, almost 600 kilometers. So doing it out and back from Williamsport to Tazewell and back is a 1,200 kilometer flight. If you go out to Blairstown, which is the glider port out far northeastern corner in northern New Jersey, it's 440 miles down to Tazewell. So it's a huge system. It's a huge set of mountain ridges and task area, and it's wonderful in that we're kind of situated right in the middle of it. Here are the major soaring spots for the system. Not everyone's here, but this is where most of the big flights take place from. You of course see Fairfield in the middle, Blairstown up in northern New Jersey, Ridge Soaring, Eagle Field up on the main ridge, Mifflin, a real popular spot we fly from often, Petersburg, a famous and good wave area, Newcastle, down here near Roanoke, and then our friends down at Front Royal. Now, of course, you notice Cumberland is right there. I don't have Cumberland listed. Maybe I should have. I think years ago, 20, 30, 40 years ago, Cumberland was a big ridge soaring spot. But no, you don't see flights out of there anymore for some reason, which is too bad because that would be a glorious place to start long ridge flights. Looking at just the northern half of the system now, these are the names of the ridges that we commonly fly. And starting here near Fairfield, you can see the High Rock Ridge, which goes down, crosses the Potomac River and joins the Blue Ridge. The Tuscarora immediately across the Hagerstown Valley, the Lewistown Ridge, Jack's Mountain Ridge, the Raystown Reservoir Ridge, the Tussey, the Nittany, and then the main ridge, also the Bald Eagle Ridge. And then moving to the east, we've got the Mantango and then the Blairstown Ridge that runs out to the northern tip of New Jersey. So those are the main ones that we fly. And then if you go further south, you'll see the main ridge, the Bald Eagle Ridge, continue down to the Mountain Grove turn point right there. It then drops back to what is the Ingalls Ridge, that short ridge right there with Ingalls Airport up on the ridgetop right in the middle. At Covington, you jump back forward a few miles to pick up the main ridge again, and then you fly it all the way down to Tazewell, which sits right there. And then if you really want to go far away, at Tazewell, you drop back to the next mountain range, and then you can fly the lower, more difficult ridges all the way to Knoxville, basically. Again, I personally have not been southwest of Tazewell. And then back behind here is the ridge, a ridge that's commonly flown out of Newcastle. Newcastle sits right there, and that's a common ridge that's flown for Newcastle tasks. And then up at the top here is, of course, the popular Massanutten Ridge. Many of us have flown. It's a great ridge, too.
I would add that it's a great ridge to start on.
It is, yeah. 2 or 3 of these ridges are very good ridges to start on, but the Massanutten is particularly nice because it's high and there's good fields all around it, and you can take an easy tow out of Front Royal. Someone, I don't know who, put together a wonderful Appalachian Ridge Google Map site. And you can go to this site and zoom in, and people, kind of like crowdsourcing, have collectively put all their comments in about those particular ridges, turn points, areas, landmarks, and so forth. If you go to this site, I mean, you yourself, if you feel so inclined, can make contributions and make comments that others can see. And I've done that. But it's a wonderful place to go to study ridges if you're going to fly a particular ridge that you haven't seen before, been on before. Go there, study it, zoom in. You can really get a lot of great information from this. Eric Mann, Papa 3, who is our Region 4 North Contest Director and flies as ASG 29 out of Blairstown, last year started a Google's group specifically on Appalachian soaring. And anyone can join this group and participate in it, and it's focused on weather forecasting for ridge flying, the Appalachians, pilot reports, and other related stuff. And it's really a great group to be part of because it's very focused right on what we do. It doesn't have anywhere near the noise and irritation that rec aviation soaring has. So you might check this out and join this group if you want to, follow along and become more involved in this. Okay, let's move on to weather forecasting, unless there's other comments or questions about the ridge system.
Mike,
yeah.
When you look at the whole lines that you see going south like that and all the ridges, some of them are small enough. Are there still lift there where the wind goes up and down? I have no idea how that works.
Well, the ones I marked on the slide are all significant enough to fly. And some of the lower ones are flyable too. It depends on the wind direction, and so forth. But it doesn't take a lot of ridge height to create good ridge lift. Like the Mantango Ridge on the east side of the Susquehanna River is a very low ridge, but it's nicely shaped. There's a good flat valley in front of it, so it turns out to be a very reliable ridge. But how much ridge do you need to ridge fly? I don't know.
No, I was going to say, when you're talking about the flat area, the valleys behind it, is there a limit where you can see if there's a valley of 2 miles that's good, or if it's a small valley?
Well, a valley of 2 miles is good. As the valley gets less and less and there's more and more upwind obstructions, it becomes a problem. I think Dave Weaver's going to talk about that further. Weather forecasting. I've broken this up into 3 sections, and I'm not an expert weather forecaster. I consider Bo Litt an expert weather forecaster. I'm still learning. But I use many of the same tools that Bo uses and probably a lot of the same tools that you guys use. So what I thought I would do is talk about 3 different groups. One is tools I use when I'm a week out, and then 2 to 4 days out, and then 1 to 24 hours out of a big flight. This Skew-T diagram on the right here is not meant to be looked at. It's supposed to be a kind of an artistic comment, just a teaser. So let's go on. The thing I look at most often when I'm trying to think a week out is I go to the surface prog charts available from NOAA on their Weather Prediction Center. They just have beautiful charts they put out that look out 7 days. They're updated every I think once a day they're updated looking that far out. But what you're looking for when you look at a surface prog chart like this, of course, is you're looking for a high pressure zone out to the west. I think the ideal position for high pressure should be right over the center, right where the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys join. And then you're typically looking for low pressure up to the north, to the northeast. This particular day I captured, I just looked about a week or 10 days ago and picked a day that might have potential. But this has potential because, again, there's going to be a northwest flow circulating clockwise around this high, bringing winds in across the lakes and down across Pennsylvania, probably around 300 to 330. So that day had potential. Whatever day that was. Issued. This is for the 7th, right? But that's typically what I look at. If you see that general setup, high to the west, low to the northeast, watch that day. And you're typically looking for isobars. Those are the lines of constant pressure here, of about that spacing. If they're spaced about like what you see there, you would expect to see about 20 knots of wind at the ridge level. And when looking at isobars, typically the wind crosses the isobar at about a 20 or 30 degree angle. So on this day, with that angle right there, I would expect to see winds at maybe 330 in central Pennsylvania, western Pennsylvania. So that's how to look at that. So you look at the isobar spacing and the direction to get a sense for the ridge level winds.
The winds are 20 to 30 degrees leaning towards the...
Well, they're flowing out of the high, toward the low, crossing the isobar at 20 to 30 degrees normally. Now, obviously, what you also want to look at is any frontal passage. Here there's a front way out to sea, so that's going to be well clear of us. But sometimes there's a front dragging right across our zone, and that obviously can bring about precip and other conditions that can be problematic. We'll look at that a little bit further. The second thing I'll look at 7 days out is just the normal, just the normal weather forecasts that we can all get through weather.com or AccuWeather or Weather Underground. I like Weather Underground. That's what I use because I think they have great graphics down below. They have a surface wind chart going out 7 or 10 days actually. Precip percentages, temperature, pressure, other things displayed graphically here. Like here, there's currently a frontal passage occurring on these 2 days. High precip, the winds are shifting west, climbing up to over 10, 12 knots at the surface. That day has good potential. Here's another day with northwest winds at the surface of 10 or 12 knots or more. Probably be maybe a more blue day because there's no precip or moisture event ahead of that. So this is a good tool too, and we all have access to that. Then when you pick a good day or pick a potential day, and you get 4 days out, then I kind of switch tools. And I think the best tool to use 3 to 4 days out is the Aviation Weather Center, their ADDS site. And they have a bunch of tabs here that are different tools to use. But the wind and temperature tool is an amazing tool. I use this all the time. And this is what you see. The colors are messed up for some reason, but you can kind of get a sense for it. But you've got the ability to look at about 3.5 days ahead by using this menu here. And then you can go up to whatever altitude you want above the surface. Typically, I look at 3,000 feet for ridge level winds. That's the altitude closest to ridgetop for us. And the wind forecast is, I think, amazingly close. What's nice, too, is it's all color-coded as well as having the little flags and pointers. And at the 40-knot point, it's easy to see the 40-knot zones and at 3,000 feet, which is nice for me because that's my kind of go, no-go point when I fly ridges. If it's over 40 knots at 3,000 feet, I don't fly. So it just graphically points that out right there. But you can monitor this out. It's updated frequently, and I monitor that all the way up to the flight. The other thing I use 2 to 3 days out is I start watching Dr. Jack. It's a great tool to use to take a global look at the region. These are the Dr. Jack has about 20 or 30 different elements or things you can look at in terms of his forecasting, but I tend to look at these, and that is the thermal strength, the wind as a kind of a check on the ADDS site, and then these 3 factors down here, which are particularly helpful now starting to understand the moisture associated with the day. The cumulus potential, will there be clouds or not? If there are, what will the cloud place be? And then what's the chance of total cloud cover? And that kind of gives you a really nice sense of what's going to happen 2.5, 3 days out.
As long as we're on a little break here, that 40-knot business, about 1.5 years ago, I guess about 5 of us were going to fly out of Fairfield today in the morning. And it turned out we got up, got pretty much ready to go, but we didn't put the gliders together because it just didn't look like it was shaping up. So we had the BODE meeting. We had the 7 o'clock BODE meeting. And so we kicked the idea around, and it looked like Front Royal was going to be a better bet. And so we hemmed and hawed for about 15 minutes, and then finally BODE, you know how BODE is, so you kind of got us pushed in the right direction. And so 3 of us, me, Mike, and BODE went down to Front Royal that day. And so I was a little concerned because they tend to hold back on tows sometimes if the weather's getting a little risque. But anyway, we get down there, and the wind is wailing on the surface. It's already 20 knots on the surface. But we rolled in there, we put the gliders together really quick, and Christiane was down there, she helped us out, and we got in the queue to take off. And so BODE was the first one ready, they launched him okay, and then Mike, I think he just had to wait for one other guy. And I got behind a couple of Front Royal guys, so I'm getting kind of pushed back, and the wind is kind of cranking up a little bit more. And then I'm all set to go, and the tow pilot's got to get gas. and so I thought they were not going to launch me because it was really turbulent and the wind was really blowing. But they cut me some slack and they launched me. And I'm here to tell you, 20 knots on the surface, it was the roughest tow I have ever had. And on my glider, I've got a CG hook. And so if you got a nose hook, you can hang on through just about anything. But if you got a CG hook, you're in danger of getting a back release if you get any slack in the rope. Yeah. So I was kind of sitting there on the edge of my seat through this whole thing, and the rotor went almost down to, it literally went down to pattern altitude at Front Royal, and the wind is really wailing, and so finally I get off tow, and I jump on the Massanutten down there, and look at my computer. The wind speed at ridge, well, I'm actually above ridge level, just barely, but it's 45 knots on the ridge. And I won't bore you with the whole story of the day, but I can definitely say that with all respects, that day was extreme in all respects. It was incredibly turbulent. Even BODE didn't go all the way down to the ridge. And it took us, I think BODE was the first one that got into the wave. It took us so long before we got into the wave. Normally it's very easy to get in the wave down there. But I think maybe these guys had a little bit better idea than I did. I was a little disappointed that I couldn't get into the wave. And then finally I realized we had to get up over 9,000 feet to actually contact the wave. And there was incredible turbulence at 9,000 feet. And my gear unlocked about 3 times in the turbulence. But it was quite the day. But that's why Mike goes with the 40 knots.
Yeah, that day again proved to me personally that there's certainly days when it's better to be on the ground wishing you were in the air rather than in the air wishing you were on the ground, which was the case that day. I wish I was on the ground that day. Now there's coffee, so why don't we take, anybody wants coffee, now's the time to break for it. Well, let's keep moving forward here with weather forecasting for Fairfield and in the area. Again, 2 to 4 days out, Dr. Jack has a useful site. And then also 2 to 4 days out, I start looking at the soundings, the GFS soundings. These soundings are fairly low fidelity, and I don't put a lot of credibility in them, but it does start to give you good winds aloft information and temperature aloft, suggesting wave or other problems or high-level clouds. So I start looking at that, but I don't use that as a go, no-go tool at this point.
Where do you look?
Well, I've got other slides prepared on how to read a Skew-T diagram. So, for which what? Well, the site right there that you see, the link is on the top there. Oh, which geographic site? I generally start looking at Hagerstown. You're immediately upwind from Fairfield. Usually, our flights take us near Hagerstown no matter what we do. So Hagerstown's always the first place to look. And then if it looks like a good day, then kind of expand out. And in fact, the next slide shows you the sites I use. Now, 1 day out, 1 to 24 hours out. Now you can jump forward and start using the the Bach 40 NAM forecast soundings, which are much higher resolution, and I consider much more accurate than the GFS soundings. And this is a typical Skew-T diagram. And I've got another slide prepared, a couple slides ahead, on how to read Skew-Ts and what I look for specifically. So let's just accept the fact that the Skew-T gives us a lot of information, and at a particular site. It gives you temperature, moisture, and winds directly above any site you want to pick. And these are the sites I typically look at day out. Start with Hagerstown. If it's good at Hagerstown, that's kind of the no-go point for starting any flight. I then generally jump upwind and look at Altoona, then go down the main ridge, look at Cumberland, then go up the main ridge to University Park at State College, then go way down the Shenandoah Valley, about 125 miles southwest, look at Shenandoah. Then I go 100 miles northeast and look at Allentown. And then finally, if it's really looking like a good day, look at Ingalls down near Covington. And that kind of gives you a point representation all over the task area for 1,000 K type flights. So that's a great tool. And this is the tool that we use. This sounding tool is what we use to make no-go decisions and make most of our last-minute plans off of. Finally, as you get a few hours out, the ADDS site has wonderful satellite imagery, too, available, both visible and IR. The visible image is what you see here. This image is taken at 12:31 Zulu, which is about 7:30 in the morning local on a February day. So the sun has been up about 30 minutes. You can see it's still dark at night in Ohio. We're starting to get illumination now and across central Pennsylvania. And you see that wonderful wave system right there. You know, if it were 8 o'clock in the morning and I saw that, I would be strapping into the cockpit as quick as possible to get airborne, because you can see the beautifully marked waves running all up and down the Shenandoah Valley, down to well into the Massanutten area. Even before visible light comes up, you can see the same sort of thing in IR. It's just lower resolution. So you can see wave bars, you can see moisture-related issues in the IR shot as well. And what's nice, too, is you can loop this image about every 15 or 20 minutes, I think. They have an update. You loop it, and you can get an animation of what's happening. It's particularly useful looking at moisture, seeing bands of moisture pass through. Is it drying out? Is it moisture increasing? The satellite loop is very useful for that.
And then finally, Mike, if you don't mind, quick question. So in that last image, they filter out any of the ground or any of, so it's purely clouds in the sky they show?
No, the ground is there. It's just.
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, do they filter out ground on this imagery to just show clouds? No, they don't. You can see ground, but it's snow, but the ground is fairly low resolution, so it becomes very faint in the background. Okay. And so primarily what you're looking at is moisture and cloud, is when you look at these diagrams. But snow, you can very nicely see snow, and if you look carefully on a clear day, you can see some ground features in there, mountains and valleys and so forth.
So off the lower right-hand side, that's the system, the clouds from the system that pass through, you think? The cloud there? Is that cloud over the ocean?
The ocean.
Offshore. Offshore of the ocean. Is that the cloud there?
Yes. Yeah, that's cloud. Down here, that's cloud in the ocean.
Okay, right.
Right, and you know, obviously there's a big cloud bank over Pennsylvania that's been broken up and opened up by the wave above.
Right.
The thing to remember about these satellites, these are weather satellites.
Right.
These are not reconnaissance satellites.
Right.
So,
And obviously an hour out, it's time to shut the computer down and go out and look up. Just so everybody's aware, Bode Lit has put together a wonderful, like 100-slide presentation on where Fairfield wave flying and winter flying and long-distance flying. I suspect a lot of you have seen him present that. If not, I would suggest that you ask him to the next time you see him, and he'll be back again to fly with us. And he'll be pleased to do that, I'm sure. And it's on the website, correct?
Yeah, we put it on the website under George's winter presentation. Maybe you've seen it. It's been presented a couple times, but now it's on our website. Cool.
So I've lifted some photographs and some stuff from his presentation. When I do that, I put his letters up in the corner so you know what's coming from him versus what's coming from me. But his presentation has a little different perspective to it. It's wonderful, and I encourage everybody to listen to him present that. But you'll see there's a little bit of crossover here. Now let's look in more detail at the Skew-T. Now I'm not an expert at reading Skew-Ts. There's probably people here that know more than I do about this. But I'll be happy to show you and share with you what I know about it and what to look for when looking at a sounding plot. This is the Bach 40 sounding that we use most often. And there's really 4 things to understand. Well, there's a lot of things to understand, but what you're looking at vertically here is altitude above the ground. And it's labeled on the left scale as pressure altitude in millibars. And over here on the right, you can see the pressure altitude in feet. So, 900 millibars is about 3,200 feet. 700 millibars is about 10,000 feet. So what we're interested in is really occurring in the lower quarter of this Skew-T diagram, with the exception that up here we can see some moisture-related issues. If you want to try to predict cirrus, you look up in the top third of the diagram. And then there's 4 things that are going on in terms of data presented. One is the moisture diagram, or the moisture line, which is this line, and that's dew point throughout the air column. The second one is the temperature of the air throughout the air column. And the last thing is the winds aloft, both direction and speed. So that's the data that's presented to you. Why is it called a Skew-T? Because the temperature lines are not going straight up and down. The temperature lines are diagonal. And there's a good reason for that, but I can't tell you why, other than it presents a nice diagram and it makes for a useful tool. And when you bring this diagram up off this website, it runs a Java program that makes it interactive on your computer, which is really great because you can take your mouse, your cursor, and put it on the ground, on the surface level, slide it back and forth to find the temperature that you expect at that time, click it, and then it basically takes a parcel of air, brings it up the dry adiabat line, and shows you when it the moisture condenses and creates clouds. And in this case, I did that. It shows we have cloud base using this diagram at 5,000 feet. The clouds will be about 1,000 feet, top to bottom. And there's good stability on top of that, so the clouds will not continue to grow and blow up out of control. So that's the value of that diagram. Now the next slide, I've got kind of sketched up now. The same diagram we saw before, but this one is sketched up with the key things to look for. Starting at the left, that's the moisture curve. You want to see some separation between the moisture curve and the temperature curve. Obviously, if those 2 curves come together, water condenses in the atmosphere, you get clouds. If they come together briefly, it's not necessarily a big problem down in this area, but if it comes together for any vertical distance, you're going to have a solid deck and maybe precip. And the more they come together, like on a really rainy day, those 2 lines will merge and go up 5,000 or 10,000 feet, one on top of the other, and that's where you get, downpours. The second thing to look at is the temperature curve, and that defines really the soaring conditions. And normally what we want to see is the temperature curve arcing or angled to the left, which represents unstable air, good thermal conditions underneath. An inflection point representing an inversion, and we want to see the temperature curve switch directions and go off to the right, which represents stable laminar air above that. And that's where the wave occurs, is in this zone. So when Bode says expect to get into the wave at 5,500 feet, that's where the bend occurs, right at 5,500 feet, which is what you see right there. So it'll be wave between that point and this point. And at this point, which is up around, whatever that is, 20,000 feet, the wave will not work anymore. It might go a little higher, but see the temperature bends back to the left, so the air is becoming unstable again, which is not conducive to keeping the wave together. So that's what you want to see. You want to see unstable air, an inversion point, and then the line arc, or best, it just makes a hard right turn, representing good stable laminar air above that. Next thing to look at is the winds above the surface. Typically, you want to see a good northwest flow all the way up through the wave layer, and that's exactly what we have here. You can see the winds are about 300, and you can see actually the wind velocity down here. You can see it down here at the ridge level, 2,000 feet, it's about 20 knots. That's great for ridge flying. And then it's increasing with altitude, which is a real good sign for wave. Wave doesn't require that to work, but the best wave occurs when the winds are increasing with altitude. And here you can see the winds are passing 50 knots at about 12,000 feet, which is just about ideal as far as I'm concerned for wave strength and being able to work the wave. And then they continue on up. So that's it. That's what we look for, simple as that. Now, the the moisture curve is real important. Sometimes the moisture curve will come up and touch the temperature curve right in this zone right here. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, some people say, oh, that's terrible, you're gonna have a solid deck, and yeah, it could happen. But we find on wave days that the wave is usually set up and strong enough, it can pull the drier air down and actually punch through the deck and open up wave gaps, and it leaves you with beautifully marked wave bands in. And I've got photographs of that further on in the presentation. So that's it, that's a Skew-T.
Mike, I would also add that in this interactive tool, you have the ability to load a series of time in 1 hour increments. So you can look at the Skew-T bars and say, okay, at daylight, this is what we should be seeing. At 10 a.m., this is what we should be seeing at 11, 12. Even at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can say, okay, the wave will still be here, or no, the wave won't be here. I better plan on being back on the home ridges before 4 because I can't get across the mountain. So we use these and I use them also in time also. And I find them very useful too.
Hey, Mike?
Yeah.
How is this data generated? They don't take sound like they used to with balloons and all that sort of thing. It's all satellite done or what?
That's a great question. It's my understanding, and maybe others. The question is, how is the sounding generated today? How is the data collected? It used to be done with balloons and balloon-based sensors, and that's still done. But I think most of the data today is remote sensing with satellites. Maybe, Glenn, you want to talk about that?
Both the GOES satellites have sounders on them that we can use right now. The next series, first launch is next April. Doesn't have the sounder, but they're saying they're going to be able to produce these to the hyperspectral imagery that it's got. So we'll see how that goes.
Brings up a question, how accurate is this data?
It's a subject of quite a bit of controversy. As you get closer, it becomes more accurate. I personally find that both the moisture prediction and the winds prediction are how should I say it, they over-predict 24 hours out. Typically, it says you're going to have too much moisture, and you're going to have winds are going to be too high 24 hours out, and then as you close in on the actual launch point, the winds and the moisture both improve. So I would caution you not to cancel the day 24 hours out looking at winds and moisture from this diagram. An hour out, then I think you can say there's too much wind or too much moisture to fly today.
So, Mike, there's another data source, it's the airliners.
Yep.
They've instrumented all the airliners in the 4-second intervals or so. As they're climbing and descending, they're gathering data that gets fed into these mountains.
And what I can't answer, though, is because you've got satellite sensing, you've got airline sensing, you've got balloons. I mean, how is that all mixed together? I don't know.
Computers.
Yeah, that's what scares me.
With respect to what is that thing in the upper left-hand quadrant? What is that bullseye?
It's a radar chart.
Yeah, is that radar or what is it?
No, I think that what that's showing you is basically it's like a balloon representation. It's showing you if you launched a balloon, that's how the balloon would have proceeded.
It's the wind speed and direction.
Yeah, at any altitude.
Hey, Mike, also on the morning of, I call flight service anyway, and one of the things I ask them about are pilot reports, because a lot of people will phone in with, radio in with pilot reports about mountain turbulence. And that's an excellent source for me. It kind of confirms that you're doing the right thing.
That's actually, Mike, I was just going to ask, are you able to see any turbulence on those charts at all?
The question is, can you see turbulence on the charts? That's a good, the good question. I mean, in the laminar zone, which is, in this zone here, it's usually icy smooth. I mean, it's just silky smooth air. It's wonderful. Down below the wave zone in the convective layer, on a day like this, you would have a lot of turbulence.
You just expect it.
Yeah. So you can't observe it directly off this chart, but you can make, some judgments based on what you see here. Eric?
And the sliding temperature that you're inputting on this is the forecast high?
At that, no, not the high, the temperature at the time that the sounding is generated. I mean, at the forecast time that the sounding is for. I mean, this one's This one's for 1500 Zulu. So, you know, 1500 Zulu at Hagerstown, you expect it to be 43 degrees. That's what you would put in there to see what you get at that time.
Does the angle make any difference on that red, where the red makes the jog to the right? Does it get?
Yeah, the more stable they are, if this is, this line can actually be about, can actually be that low. The more stable they are, the better the wave.
The better the wave.
The better the wave. Yeah.
I've actually seen that, Mike, where that line lays horizontal. And
Yeah.
it starts back.
Yeah, extremely stable air.
Yes.
Is there any difference between ridge and wave in what you're looking at for this?
Well, yeah. I mean, clearly, when you fly a ridge, you're down in this zone down here. When you're flying wave, you're in this zone up here. So, I mean, you got...
Would there be anything you're looking for? Hey, it's not a good wave day, but it might be a good ridge day?
Yeah, I mean, you can have a good ridge day without this wave, this laminar flow wave area above it. I mean, this line can kind of come up and just go straight up. And we have a lot of days like that.
Ridge is just a very simple phenomenon. You just need wind. Wave is a much more complex phenomenon.
Yeah, I should have made that point, that ridge flying, you don't even need to be concerned about what's above, other than does the moisture line come together with the temperature line to create clouds and rain. But you just look at the winds down here in that zone there.
Mike, before you leave this stuff, I just heard Rich bring up that issue about the airliners carrying the sensors.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to put in a minor plug on that. A couple of years ago, the office that I was working at the Pentagon, they had a briefing presented to them on that system. The military was interested in it because they fly into places where there is no weather forecasting, essentially. At least no in-place weather forecasting. You've got remote sensing, but no in-place forecasting. So that's why the military was interested in that system. So I was familiar with this system when the guys made the pitch. So I pulled the guy off to the side, you know, after he made the pitch, and it was just before the Mifflin contest a couple of years ago. And I said, hey, you know, I'm going to go fly in this glider contest up here. Would you guys have the time, and would you be interested in providing data for the contest? And then I talked to Richard Kellerman, was the weather guy, and so I got them to ship the data to Richard to use for his presentation. And so he used the data provided by them, which was very detailed and very dense data, as opposed to the normal stuff that's available. And so it actually turned out it was the most accurate forecasting that Richard was able to glean from that. So
that's just like launching a balloon.
Yeah,
it's
so
very,
it's
real data.
Yeah.
On this particular day, at 15Z, you can see the clouds are at 5,000 feet. The clouds are about at the cloud base is 5,000, about 1,000 feet deep. Now, if you go to the actual satellite shot at the same day, same time, this is what you see. And sure enough, Hagerstown, which is right there, you get clouds, you know, scattered clouds at 5,000 feet, about 1,000 feet in depth, and you see the wave banding. So the wave is working very nicely above the clouds, and they're separating the clouds into nice gaps and nice linear features, which is what you want to see for a wave, with nice ridge flying underneath. And on this particular day, there was only one significant flight that I could find. That was Daniel Sation from Blairstown. Flew a very nice flight in a Duck Hawk, starting up here, came down, jumped up through the Tuscarora, and then went home. You can see he flew the ridge with thermals for transitions without any wave flying, but he took advantage of it and made the most of it. Now I've got a couple other days to analyze just to look at weather. This is Christmas Day, just 2 weeks ago, and I sent this slide out to everyone as a teaser, because it was a fantastic day. I mean, it's just too bad it fell on Christmas. It did ruin my, I was stuck to the computer all day.
Thank you, baby Jesus.
Look out the window all day.
Looking first at the surface prog chart, you can see the powerful low up to the northeast. In fact, there's a double low with a front dropping all the way running from Canada to Cuba. It moved well past us by 15Z, you know, which is, you know, 8 o'clock, 15Z, 10 o'clock in the morning. The high is well out to the southwest of us. You can see it's more of a westerly flow, rather than a northwest flow, but it still would have been a great ridge day for us. Here's the satellite imagery showing the great wave system set up, and there's even streets running through the wave bars, which gives you a sense for wind direction. You see it's about 280 to 290 at cloud base. The beauty of this is, look, you can see the wave system is set up all the way from western Pennsylvania, runs to the Chesapeake Bay. And I counted, there's 25 wave bars from western Pennsylvania back to the Chesapeake. And those initial wave bars right here, these wave bars out here were set up by these mountains right here. There's two mountain ridges out just east of Pittsburgh. That often initiates the wave, and it comes back and gets reinforced from the subsequent wave, or the subsequent mountain ridges. And that just beautifully shows it. And obviously you've got the wave markers running from all the way down the Shenandoah Valley and all the way down the main ridge as far as this shot goes, all the way up to Williamsport. I mean, that would be a 1,000K day in wave alone, had we flown it. Anyway, it was painful to look at that.
Other than that,
Mike, can you point out on the Skew-T some, I mean, the characteristics, like you see the temperature line there as being very flat, you know,
Yeah.
as per what you were saying.
Yeah, here we go. We got the convective layer coming up. The wave would start about 6,000 feet right there at the inflection point. Notice this is what I was talking about. See the way that the moisture curve, the dew point curve touches the temperature curve? That tells you there's going to be a cloud deck, which is exactly what you see here. There's a solid cloud deck throughout the region, but the wave is strong enough, it punches the dry air down through the cloud deck and creates the wave gaps. And that's what happens when they touch like this, which is really a good thing. And in this case, we would expect the wave to work from 6,000 feet up to around 10 or 11,000. And often the wave can go a little higher than the stable air, so I would expect the wave to probably work from 6 to 11 or 12,000 feet on this day.
But you've got a cloud deck at 7, right, roughly?
Well, yeah, it shows clouds forming at 6 to 7,000 feet, which is exactly what's happening out here.
But look at the gaps on the photograph
Yeah.
that the drier air from above creates.
Yeah, the drier air dips down and
Right.
opens up the gaps in the cloud deck. And that's what we fly in. That's the beauty of having these two curves touch right there, is it creates the markers in the wave gaps.
You could throw a switch and shut that wind off, that would be 100% cloud cover.
Exactly.
Like that. As long as that wave's there, it's opening up those.
The other thing that for the wave novices amongst us, the problem with having no moisture is the wave works just fine without any moisture. The trouble is you can't see it. And so you're kind of using the Braille method. You know, I mean, you know about where it ought to be, but it's real easy to fall out of the wave doing that because you lose track of where the bar is.
Mike?
Yeah.
Okay, on a situation like this, I might have concern with those wave gaps closing up quickly. Do you have any experience with looking at forecasts? Let's say you're looking at this and you say, I want to fly, but you look ahead on the forecast, and if you see them crossing deeper, does that represent risk of wave gaps closing?
That's true. If you look at the forecast and you see this, instead of just touching, becoming more and more in contact as the day goes on, you want to be concerned about moisture increasing and the gaps closing. Okay. That is true. And I'll talk a little bit later about not getting caught on top and how to not get caught on top.
How there's gaps and all, can you anticipate sink and all in those areas? So like if you're coming back in, you've been running the wave, and you go through the gap, would you not anticipate sink going through those?
Let me address that in a later slide on my wave, the wave flying basics slide.
Mike, before you get off this, one of the important things that I look for is that frontal passage, because that really defines the boundary between the stable air and the unstable air. You know, you've got cool, drier air moving from being pulled down out of Canada that tries to sneak in under that warm, stable air, and that's what creates this boundary. So that moving front, the wave almost always follows that front. So the frontal passage has to happen, and you have to have the winds perpendicular to the ridges, but that's one of the first indicators to me, that frontal boundary passing.
Let's move on. Here's the sounding from January 1st. I think how much you guys flew January 1st. I did not, but this is what you had. And what to look for here is, again, we had the solid, very stable air going from, in this case, it started at about 3,500 feet. It was a low inversion, which allowed you, to engage the wave at a low altitude. And it was capped at maybe 10,000. But I think, the reports that day were you were getting to 12 or so?
Yeah. 12, we really got what, 12.5?
12 and blue.
12 and a smidge.
Yeah, so you were getting up about this point on the curve. So you're actually getting above the stable air, but at that point, the air went unstable again, which kind of kills the wave. And you can notice here, too, that there's a big separation between the dew point curve and the temperature curve, which says it's going to be a blue day, which is what you had.
We also had wind in a not really favorable direction.
Exactly. Look over here. The winds below in the convective layer were southwest.
It was kind of ephemeral in the wave.
Yeah, the wave doesn't work great in that condition, but it can work okay. But once you got up into the laminar flow zone, the wave zone, the winds shifted west, which was a good thing. And we hear you.
In that it actually, the wave improved during the day, which is fairly rare.
And this is, what day is this? This is, this is the same day. Just a different plot. And that's it. That's all I have on forecast. Any other comments on weather forecasting?
Question. Mike, how much time do you spend per week on doing this?
If there's a good day coming up, how much time? If there's a good day coming up, I see a week out, it's 20 minutes a day when you're 4 or 5 days out, and then you get closer, it becomes almost an hour a day to start looking at everything. So it's I miss Bode, because he would sit there and do that and give us these wonderful reports, and now I have to do it, You got a question?
Yeah, so as you go through your forecast cycle, how do you get the word out that you may have favorable conditions for a flying day?
How do we communicate with the group?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got an email. We got an email group that we've collected. Are you not on the group?
Is that the Yahoo group?
No, it's
Not on that group.
okay. Just email me and I'll put you on the group.
Okay.
There's about 45 of us in the club that could just exchange emails on good days.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, Mr. Weaver.
Okay. All right, so this is really neat to see all you guys here today, and I'm a little intimidated because I like to pace around, is that all right?
It's fun with me.
Okay, but there's just as many people in our little audience here that are extremely well qualified to talk about this kind of stuff. We've got a lot of very experienced wave and ridge pilots with us today, so feel free to join in. This presentation is primarily geared to the novice ridge pilot, the ridge pilot wannabe, if you will. So that's kind of the way we're going to address this. So put this up here, a little inspirational slide about so why do we want to do this? Well, it's definitely challenging, and you can see by some of the things we talk about that how challenging it can be at times. And it's definitely exciting. There's something wrong with your heart if you don't think this is exciting. And this is definitely fun. I've had some of my most memorable experiences bombing down the ridge at 100 knots or so. Last year at the annual meeting, I think I talked a little bit about goal setting. So I'm hoping some of the new guys out here are interested in setting that goal, maybe getting on out to the ridge and giving this a try. And then, so then you got to ask yourself, though, is this dangerous? I'm sure you've heard a lot of stories about things, and the truth of the matter is it can be. So it has to be approached in a sane manner, and you've got to operate within your own personal envelope. So a lot of the criteria that I lay out for you here is going to be criteria that are pretty safe for a beginning ridge guy. Now, those of us that have flown on the ridge a lot of time, we've flown in less than optimum conditions. And so as the conditions become less optimum, it becomes more challenging, and you're pushing towards the outside of the envelope that you ought to be flying in. So that's just something you need to keep in mind when you do this. Okay, so a little bit about ridge flying basics. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the ridge works or not. A little bit about the basic criteria that you ought to be looking at to go venture on out towards the ridges to fly on them. We're going to look at some of the rules of the road that you ought to be considered, because when you get out there, if it's a good ridge day, you're going to find some of the rest of us out there with you. And in addition to that, I know Danny's got some of his hang glider buddies out here, and depending on how much wind we have that day, the hang gliders could be out there as well. And there's always the odd bird out there too that we'd rather not run into. So a couple things about that. We're going to talk a little bit about just basically flying on the ridge and some of the transitions that need to be done when you're out there flying. We're going to talk about a few of the problems you may run into when you're out there. And then finally, Mike has covered a lot of this, but I'm going to touch on just some very basic planning factors. And I think Mike has done a pretty good job of that already. Okay, so first of all, this is not a perfect graphic. And Mike critiqued me a little bit on this one. Not my graphic, but I think it generally shows what you want to think about when you're out there. Okay, so this is a generic ridge. I mean, this whole picture changes depending on the shape of the ridge, the velocity of the winds. Is there any thermal activity? But this is generally what you're looking for. Okay, so the lift zone is normally slightly out in front of the ridge. It's further out in front of the ridge the higher you are above the ridge. So if you're very close to the ridge, flying very fast, you're generally pretty close to the peak of the ridge. If you're flying a little slower, a little bit higher altitude, then you're normally a little bit further in front of the ridge. So this is something to keep in mind when you're flying on the ridge and you're searching for that sweet spot, if you will. So, but generally, the lift is certainly out in front of the ridge by some amount. It is definitely not right over the top of the ridge. And particularly, some of the ridges that we fly have a rounded shape to them as opposed to a more conical shape. And the rounded shaped ridges, the wind is almost parallel to the top of the ridge. And that's not a good place to be right there at the top. And you certainly don't want to be on the lee side because the wind is, or the air is definitely going down back there. So think slightly out in front of the ridge. Okay, some of the basic criteria, and again, I'm going to caveat this a little bit because what I'm trying to present you with here is safe criteria to go out and venture out onto the ridge in your early stages of flying. So the wind at ridge level, I say 15 knots minimum. And here's why I say that. Anybody that's flown the ridges around here knows that we have ridges that will work with less than 15 knots of wind. That's absolutely true. A good example of that is the Jacks Mountain Ridge by Mifflin, particularly the back side of that ridge. That'll work with a lot less than 15 knots. It's not necessarily fun, but it'll work with a lot less than 15 knots. But on our ridges that we have here, 15 knots is a good, solid, have a good time number. It's not going to be incredibly turbulent, but it's going to be strong enough so that you don't have to worry too much about it. Okay, 30 knots max. Now, Mike talked about his personal limit is 40. Well, you know, so if 15 knots is good, 50 knots ought to be better, right? Okay, so I guarantee you the ridge is working if you got 50 knots of wind. It's definitely working, but it is working in a manner that you don't even want to think about. So it is incredibly rough. When the wind starts getting over 30 knots, it is, you know, teeth-jarring rough. And so 30 knots. The other thing is, and Mike's going to talk about this a little bit later on, but if you got more than 30 knots of wind at ridge level, making transitions, getting out to the ridge, that's going to be a heck of a tough row to hoe. So think in these terms, 15 to 30 knots. That's what you're really looking for, and I'm talking at ridge level. Okay, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you have to worry about when you're deciding your max wind limit is you may have to put it into a farm field.
Absolutely
and
true.
Putting it into a farm field with 30 knots on some of our ridges could be very, very interesting.
That's absolutely true. So that's just another criteria. So again, we're trying to figure out how to get you guys started on flying the ridge and keep you in a reasonable operating envelope. Okay, so I say no more than 30 knots, or correction, 30 degrees normal to the ridge. And so again, will the ridge work with more than 30 degrees off? Of course it will. How well will it work? Well, it depends on the ridge. It depends on the ridge, and it depends on the wind velocity. But for your early stages, your early adventures out onto the ridge, think in terms of you want the wind no more than 30 knots off of normal. Normal meaning perpendicular to the ridge. So that'll keep you in pretty good shape. Okay, wind at the field. So okay, we're all set to go have a good time out on the ridge. So what kind of flying conditions can you expect at the field? Well, usually, if we're having a good ridge day, this is not always the case, but we're looking at a 15-knot quartering tailwind for the takeoff. So before you think about adventuring out to the ridges, make sure that you've got a good grasp on handling your sailplane, just around the local area when you've got a substantial tailwind and a crosswind landing back at the field, and be aware of all the ramifications of doing that, because it's turbulent in the pattern, you've got the crosswind, you've got substantial amounts of sink in the pattern. So just be prepared for that.
Dave?
Yes.
That's one of the reasons I mentioned Front Royal. When I started doing it, that's the first place I chose to go, because the takeoff is usually dead into the wind.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about that.
So I'd like to add one more thing before you go on, as far as the speed at ridge level.
Okay.
I think it's, from the hang glider perspective, it's very important to also see the wind speed from surface up to the ridge level, because that's going to tell you how much compression is up against that ridge.
Sure.
So if it's 15 knots at ridge level and it's light and variable on the surface, there's a good indication that you're not going to get to see a lot of strong lift, right in front of the ridge, because there's just not enough compression.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, I throw up this last bullet on this slide, cross-country experience. Okay, let there be no doubt about it. If you're going out to the ridge, you're going on a substantial cross-country. And that should not be your first cross-country. There is I hesitate to say high probability, but there is a substantial probability that when you're headed on out to the ridge that you're going to land off field. I mean, there's just no two ways about it, especially in the early go of this, because from our location, and Mike's going to talk about it a little bit more, but from our location here at Fairfield, you've got to fly 30 miles to get to our primary ridge. So that's a 30-mile cross-country just to get to the ridge. And if the conditions are good, if you've got good wave, good thermal conditions, there are all kinds of ways to land out while you're out there. Ask me, I've done it. I've done it. Now the wave, if we've got good wave working, and again, Mike, I don't want to talk too much about this because Mike's going to hit this. If we've got good wave, it makes it a little bit less of a challenge. It's a slower go, but it's a little bit less of a challenge to get to the wave, or get to the ridge rather, because you can climb up in the wave and you can hop the wave harmonics out to the ridge. Now it's a little bit slower going because typically the wind velocities are higher at those altitudes, but you can take your time, pace yourself out there. You might spend an hour and a half getting to the ridge, but it's a little bit more relaxed. Now sometimes we've got thermals to get out the ridge, sometimes it's got wave. But in any event, you are clearly on a good cross country if you're heading out to the ridge. And I know that before my first ridge flight, I sort of had these visions of, hey, this is great. You're just cruising down this ridge and it's a contiguous deal where there's just constant lift and you're just blowing down the ridge. Well, we do have sections of the ridge that are like that, but there are also all kinds of opportunities on the ridge to conduct an off-field landing. So you need to have some amount of experience in flying cross-country and landing off-field to go fly the ridge. So it's a great experience, but just resign yourself to the possibility of landing off-field. You really have to do that, and you got to be prepared for that. Okay, so a little bit about the rules of the road. So we basically have kind of three perspectives on the rules of the road, and they're not greatly different, but there's a little bit of difference. Okay, I say the SSA standard. It's kind of like the training standard. And there's really only one significant point of departure, and I'll show you that in a couple slides here. And then we've got kind of the competition perspective. You know, the guys that are flying competition fly the ridge a little bit different than somebody that's just going out there for a Sunday afternoon, to sample the ridge, if you will. And then there's, what we do. We do sort of a hybrid, depending on what we're trying to do. So, first thing, always turn away from the ridge. Okay, this seems, fairly intuitive, but not so much in the heat of the moment. So always keep this in mind. If you're flying at ridge level, you need to be turning away from the ridge. And so why would you want to be turning? Okay, you could be trying to do a course reversal. You get to the end of the ridge, and you need to do a course reversal to head on up the other way. You could be making a transition, or you could be deciding to leave the ridge and thermal up off the ridge. So if you're trying to leave the ridge, it's often necessary to fly a figure-8 pattern. So you turn away from the ridge, and then that turns you back into your thermal, and then you turn away from the ridge in the opposite direction. So you're making alternating left and right turns in order to climb up off the ridge. And then at some point, you'll hopefully be high enough so that you can fly a complete circle. But for those initial circles, you need to definitely turn away from the ridge. Turning into the ridge is, a bad deal. So don't do that. Okay, next thing. If you're flying fast enough to overtake somebody, or somebody's flying very slow and they're above you, try not to position yourself either directly above or directly underneath another glider, because they can't see you. And so there's no telling there's no telling exactly what they might do. They might accelerate, they might decelerate, they might hit a patch of sink and fall on you. So it's really a bad idea to be directly underneath somebody or directly above somebody. So don't let that happen. Either fly faster and pass them, or slow up and follow them, or change your position laterally if you've got that, if you've got the ability to do that. Okay, now here's where we come into a little bit of difference between the rules of the road. Okay, the standard procedure, pretty much universal, is when you pass somebody, you pass them on the ridge side. And so the reason why you do that is fairly intuitive, because we just talked about in the previous slide, you always turn away from the ridge. So if you're always turning away from the ridge, the safest thing to do is pass the guy on the inside, because if he decides to turn, he's going to turn away from you. So that sounds pretty good. And so that worked for decades. And then people like Carl Streetick and Tom Knopf and many others started flying the ridge in a very in a different manner, a very aggressive and a competition type manner. And we've got some competitions around the country, most notably the one at Mifflin, where the ridge comes into play on a competition day. And so when you're flying the ridge in a competition, you're flying fast. And most of the guys are experienced. And most of the guys are optimizing the ridge. And so to optimize the ridge, you're flying very close to the ridge. And so what that all boils down to is there's not room to pass the guy on the inside. I mean, maybe if you're Carl Streeter, you might be able to do that. But for the most part, everybody's flying aggressively enough, so there just simply isn't room to pass the guy on the inside. So what do? So what you do is you pass them on the outside if you're flying that much faster than they are. But the way you do it is when you get even with their tail, you can see what their, if you don't already know it, you know what their contest ID is. And you call them and tell them that you're passing on their right. And so that's very key. You know, talk to people. Another thing that we do that I'll throw out right now is when we fly the ridges, typically here, we have certain points on the ridges that are well known to the guys that are flying, like Lockings on the south end, and Thompsontown, and Honey Grove, you know, and Burnt Cabins. We typically announce our passing of those points and whether we're northbound or southbound on the ridge. And we do that so that if there's any other traffic out on the ridge, then everybody knows to be looking for somebody. And when we do the, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that we have a ridge that has, you know, people in the air call different things.
Yeah.
Lockings, that we call it, is called something else.
Yeah,
like
Dickey.
Blairstown.
Yeah, the Blairstown guys, they've got some slightly different names. And
we call them Dickies.
Yeah, and sometimes we have the same thing that are in different places. The same name, but a different place. I found that out at the last Mifflin, the last Mifflin contest. I was enjoying myself blowing down the ridge at a fairly high rate of speed, headed towards the McConnellsburg turn point on the Tuscarora. And I wasn't really looking at my computer very much because I said, well, shoot, I know where I'm going here. And so I'm getting close to McConnellsburg, and so I glanced down at my computer to make sure that I tagged the circle, and I look down, and my computer says the turn point's 90 degrees off to my right. And I'm going, what the heck is up with that? And so the folks at Mifflin that run the contest, their McConnellsburg turn point is over the town. Our McConnellsburg turn point is on the ridge. So fortunately, there was a thermal there, and I just pulled up into the thermal and cruised out over, tagged turn point, and got back on there. But that was pure luck. So,
Dave, what's the best name to find names of the ridges?
the names of the actual ridges or the names of the turn points?
Ridges.
Okay, I've got a graphic here in a couple of graphics that I use here in a couple minutes, and there are a number of places online, but I was going to put a plug in for this. I'll say a little bit about this now. I've got a piece of software on my computer that's called Topo USA, and it's not very expensive. It's, I don't know, $70 or something. And it is a fantastic piece of software from a standpoint of looking the graphic presentation of topography. And it is good enough so that you can see all the subtleties of the ridges, and you can actually do fly-throughs of the ridges. So you can put yourself on the ridge, and there's a bunch of software out there. Eric introduced me to into one that's great for reflying flights that are flown, which those are definitely valuable as well. But from a standpoint of strictly looking at the topography of the ridge, I've seen nothing better than Topo USA. And so I'll show you a couple of graphics here in a little bit. But anyway, back to passing people. So the bottom line is, if you're with a bunch of guys that are flying in a high-performance manner, optimizing the ridge, you're going to need to pass them on the outside. If they're really maximizing the ridge, you won't be able to pass them. But anyway, that's how we get into the situation. Okay. If you're in a head-on situation, the guy that has the ability to alter his course to the right, away from the ridge, is the guy that needs to move. So if you're oncoming and you're at similar altitudes, that's what you've got to do. And you've got to be constantly looking out for this sort of situation. This is particularly true if there's hang gliders out there, because you will be overtaking the hang gliders. We fly much faster than the hang gliders do. So you'll overtake the hang gliders, and the other sailplanes that are out there, you know, a head-on situation, you've definitely got to be heads up and looking out there. Because you definitely got the potential for a midair if you're not paying attention. And that's the other reason why we kind of call our positions at those various points.
You'll be up in the air and you'll think, I'm the only one here on this ridge. You'll have someone blast past from another state.
Yeah, yeah, not everybody, yeah, that's the other thing. Not everybody makes those calls at the points. Now, the Blairstown guys, I think they sort of picked that up from us a little bit. You know, so if they hear us out there, they'll be making, the Blairstown guys will be making the calls on the ridge as well. And they do it, they typically do it down on, when we fly the Massanutten, and when the Front Royal guys are flying the Massanutten, they typically do that too. So that's a good thing.
Are you going to cover the relationship between speed and altitude? I understand that the closer you are, you go faster. You're going to talk about
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk just for a couple seconds here about what's good and what's not so good. So what's good? Okay, wind. Lots of wind, but not too much. And I think we talked a little bit about the criteria of that. And also, obviously, you want the perfect angle. Perfect angle is normal to the ridge. Anything less than that is not as good as that. Okay, speed. Lots of speed. Speed is good. Okay, you might be thinking, well, hey, I don't want to fly so fast. You know, I don't want to fly 100 knots, 110 knots. If you can fly 110 knots, you're in good shape. That's what tells you how well the ridge is working. If you can fly at 110 knots and still stay up, you've got some good ridge lift. You're not looking at much trouble. So now let's talk about speed and altitude, which Jean just brought up. Okay, if you're doing 110 knots, 100 feet off the ridge, you know, you're pretty low altitude, but that's a pretty safe condition. Because if you're able to fly that fast, you've got plenty of lift, you've got all kinds of excess energy. So if something happens to your ridge lift, you know, you've got a lot of options. Okay, if you're at 100 feet off the ridge and you're flying at 50 knots, you're in trouble. Okay, there's no two ways about it. You have got a problem. And again, one criteria that I didn't put up there. If you're just above the ridge, say 100 feet above the ridge, and your speed is less than 70 knots, you got a problem. I mean, will the ridge work? Especially if you're a new guy. You don't want to be out there just above the ridge at less than 70 knots. I mean, that is, you're looking for problems.
But if it's the case, if the ridge is working, if you force yourself, let's say, to stay at 50 knots, it means that you're not going to climb probably.
I'm not sure what you're saying.
So with the strength of the lift there, if you're going slow, you're going to probably go up and then stabilize somewhere much higher.
Well, that depends. It depends on the day.
No, I'm saying if the day is good.
If the day is good and you're flying at 50 knots, you're 2,000 feet above the ridge.
Right. That's exactly right.
Okay, so that's the other thing. If you just want to go out there, sample the ridge in a casual manner and not worry about too much, you can fly, you know, at least 1,000 on a fantastic day, maybe more than that above the ridge at a low speed. On some days, you could be 1,500 feet above the ridge and fly at 70 knots. I mean, that's completely doable. But what I'm saying is you've got to associate the speed with the altitude. So if you're just above the ridge, like I said before, and you're less than 70 knots, you're in trouble. Okay, I mean that is a problem, you know, looking to get worse. And so, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt you. General question: at that speed, is it just sea and hang glider?
Oh, it's pretty easy. Yeah, I mean hang gliders are pretty visible.
They're stationary.
Go
Can I make
ahead.
a quick comment about that? I know there's some paranoia in the hang gliding crowd. When there's hang gliders in the air, the sailplane pilots are announcing there's hang gliders over Massanutten, there's hang gliders at High Rock, and seriously, you're a dot. We see you. It's.
And we're always and you know I can't say anything. I can't say it's perfect. I mean we're but I can guarantee you that we're looking for hang gliders, and we are familiar with most of the common hang glider launch sites. we're definitely attuned to the ones at McConnellsburg, High Rock, of course, and down on the Massanutten near Woodstock. And
have you heard any stories about traveling at 110 knots, 100 feet off the ridge, and suddenly
The hang glider pops
by
out.
hang glider?
Well, it's
I've
if
never
you're doing that, it's too windy to fly hang. If they're doing that, it's too windy to fly hang glider.
that's probably true.
It's okay. Seriously.
Another question for the hang glider folks, are any of you radio equipped?
Not aviation radio.
2 meter.
Not 2 meter.
So, go ahead, Dave.
I would submit, back to Dean's question, I would submit that flying, on the Great Ridge today, flying at 50 knots at 1,500 feet, you're not really going to learn much about the ridge. So it would behoove you to get down closer to the ridge, knowing that you have the safety, you can just pull back, slow down, and really climb.
That's true, yeah.
Because at 1,000 feet or 1,500 feet above the ridge, you're not going to learn what you really need to learn to be safe on the ridge. When you end up out there, and the wind is not normal to the ridge, and you're at 50 knots, and you're 75 feet off the ridge.
That's true. What were we going to say, Chris?
What's the typical working altitude when you're on the ridge?
You mean MSL or above the ridge?
Above ridge.
If it's a good day, the average, one of us that flies the ridge all the time, 50 or 100 feet off the ridge.
Screaming. Yeah, screaming. Hey, Dave, I'd like to make a pitch here. Tom Knopf has been putting this book out. I'm going to pass it around on flying the Bald Eagle Ridge, which goes through a lot of these articles, but he's very specific about the energy state you're at when you're at 50, 55, 60 knots and something happens. If you're on a low ridge, this is a landout. So as your speed starts decreasing and you move closer and closer to a ridge, you must keep fields that you can land in.
And the other thing is, I was going to talk about it a little bit later, but since you bring that up, it's a hard decision, I'll say. If the ridge conditions start to deteriorate, it's easy to say this, it's not so easy to do it, but you must give up the ridge before the conditions get too bad. I mean, I'm sure everybody that's flown the ridge a lot here has got countless stories about somebody trying to make the ridge work when it really wasn't. I've got a number of them. I know people that failed to make it work and ended up in the trees. And it's like, but being slow when you're just above the ridge, that's just the worst thing ever. And you're also subject to, it only takes a little bit of sink, and you're in the trees doing that. So, what were you going to say?
I'll say one more thing too.
Okay.
What may not be intuitive about the 70 knots is 70 knots is comfortable, but the ridge doesn't go straight. So what happens is 70 knots may be fine on this one spot where the wind is weak, but it's directly at 90 degrees. As soon as you start turning into the wind or downwind, all of a sudden that, you're not going to have that. So
that's right.
So it is a good rule of thumb, but it's for a number of reasons, not just.
So you said wind direction limits are about 30 degrees from ridge normal. What happens when the wind starts getting into that area?
Well, everything, nothing is cut and dried and perfect.
Sure.
I mean, and the other thing, and I'm going to steal my own thunder here, but I got a couple of slides later that, from Mike's diagrams of the ridge system, you already know that the ridge is not a straight line. The ridge curves. And so the wind is not typically the same at one end of the ridge as it is the other end of the ridge. And so you're going to have a variety of conditions as you progress along this ridge. And so, when you get away from the 30 degrees, you've got less than optimum. So how much less than optimum can you accept? That's why you need to approach this with a little caution to begin with to determine how much less than optimum you can accept. Because you could have fantastic winds on the southern end of the ridge, and then as the ridge starts to bend around to the east, the wind is like way less than optimum, and you've just got to kind of feel what's going on, And you're keeping an eye on the wind angle as you're cruising up there and the velocity. And so as things become less than optimum, you typically slow down and get above the ridge a little bit. And then depending on what kind of a day you're having, if it's the time of year when we've got substantial thermals on the ridge, then you start bumping those thermals and not flying the ridge quite so aggressively. And so sometimes you even transition off the ridge into a more thermal environment. So you start hopping thermals in the non-optimum parts of the ridge, flying higher, and then when you come back the other way, maybe you drop back down onto the ridge again. So, all these ridge flights are almost always some sort of a hybrid flight. They're a hybrid thermal ridge flight or wave ridge flight.
Or all three.
Or all three. Or all three. Okay, so, yellow arc. I should make a mention of that. Most of the sailplanes we fly, you're into the yellow arc if you're much over 100 knots. Some of them a little bit higher, some of them a little bit slower. But, in general, if you're over 100 knots, you're into the yellow arc. So, again, depending on what sort of day you're having, you need to think about, is it a good idea to be flying in the yellow arc or not? If it's really rough, maybe it's not such a good idea. If it's there's not really such a thing as a smooth ridge flight, but there's levels of rough. So you've got to gauge that. But just be advised, if you're over 100 knots, you're probably in your yellow arc, and you got to give that some thought.
And I hope you have some foam or something in your hat.
That's right. No matter how tight you pull your seat belts, you will hit your head on something.
I actually exhale to tighten my straps.
Okay, I think Dave or Paul mentioned. Go ahead.
This happened to me. This is on the ski hill. Flying the ridge, the ski hill ridge is not very long, but I put my head through the canopy, flying on the ski hill.
Through the canopy?
So it can get rough.
You made a sports canopy, huh?
And then another sports canopy.
Your head gets cold.
It can be very rough, even on a completely reasonable ridge day. A completely reasonable ridge day, 20 knots of wind. I mean, it can be rough to the point that your hand is sliding off the stick. I mean,
I would say usually that's when you hit your head the hardest, because you drop down out of wave onto the ridge, and you're now screaming on the ridge, and you come to some feature on the ridge, the wind, who knows what it is, but it will knock you senseless.
But yeah, it can be rough. So, and you thought your canopy was pretty tight. When you hear your canopy rattling, your gear unlocks. It's getting up there. Okay, I think Paul and whoever else was, but talked about keeping places to land in mind. Okay, this is critical. I already talked about, you're definitely on a cross country. You definitely got some off-field landing possibilities doing this. But flying the ridge and getting out to the ridge, you need to always be thinking about where you're landing. Now, most of you, even the beginners that are with us, you've heard the speech about, how you basically funnel on down. You're thinking about places to land. 2,000 feet, you're kind of like to be in an area where there's places to land, and 1,000 feet, you probably ought to have a specific field picked out. Okay, in the ridge, you're sometimes below pattern altitude. The whole time you're flying, you're already below pattern altitude. You're less than a minute potentially from being on the ground when you're flying that ridge. Think about that. You're out there flying on this ridge, and you're less than a minute from being on the ground if things are not working out. So things are happening fast, so you constantly have to be looking out ahead of you and remembering what's behind you as far as looking for places to land. And so we fly a lot of ridges, and I'm sure Mike's going to talk about this more, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but we fly a lot of ridges that have wonderful places to land. Some brief examples of that. He talked about the Massanutten. Massanutten's got some good places. The Jacks Mountain at Mifflin, wonderful valley with places to land there. Tussey. We also fly some ridges where there's not such great places to land. There are some places that we fly there. Now, so when you commit to flying in those places, you do that on a day when the conditions are good. I mean, it's not too mysterious. It doesn't take long before you know whether you're having a good ridge day or not. And so before you venture into one of these places that's unlandable, you need to have a feel for how the ridge is working, and then you make that decision. Okay, so smooth air. Smooth air is good. We rarely get it on the ridge, but smooth air is good because you don't bang your head on things. Okay, thermals. We talked a little bit about that. It's great to have thermals out there on the ridge. They do a number of things for us. First of all, they may have gotten us out to the ridge, so that's a good thing. When you're flying along the ridge, there are places on the various ridges that work better than others. And there's transitions that need to be made, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the thermals help us make those transitions. They help us, and it's very interesting. I don't know, the lesser experienced guys in the group, I don't know what your concept of flying the ridge. I know before, I had ever flown on the ridge, I had this picture of I'm cruising along in this contiguous volume of air, and it's just the same, all the way up and down the ridge. Well, it's definitely not like that. And when you hit a thermal on the ridge, it's very obvious, particularly if it's a springtime thermal that's really cranking. And the thermals, Tom talks about it in his book a little bit. He talks about how the thermals get pushed up the slope, but there's certain places on the ridge that tend to generate really good thermals. And so depending on what we're trying to do, if we're trying to make a transition, if we're trying to thermal up and leave the ridge, this is what we're looking for. So the thermals are great. So we pull up into the thermal, and magically we turn into this. If it's a wonderful day, which happens quite often around here, actually, we can turn into an 8-knot thermal. Climb up off the ridge and merrily head on back to Fairfield. Sometimes it doesn't work that way, but anyway, so thermals are good.
Dave, how do you transition from the ridge lift to the thermal? How do you feel it?
Okay, what happens is you're cruising along in the ridge lift, and you will feel it as turbulence. Sometimes, it varies from day to day, but sometimes you can feel it building. As you're approaching this thermal, you can feel it building, and you'll start to climb, and so your choice, again, depending on exactly what you're trying to do at that moment. Sometimes you push and go faster. Other times, if you feel like it's a really big one, you're going to slow down because you don't want to go any faster. But it's very obvious the first time you get into this. And so you find these thermals lying around the ridge, and when you hit a good one, you just pull up into it. You might gain hundreds of feet in just a couple of seconds. And so you find yourself going from maybe 100 feet off the ridge to 500-600 feet off the ridge if that was your goal, if you wanted to do that. And like I said, whether you climb in this thermal or not just depends on what you're trying to do. If you're approaching a transition, that's perfect. Like the ideal thing on, and again, Mike's going to talk about this, but on certain points on the Tuscarora, we've got to make certain transitions, and I won't talk about the details of it, but magically, on a perfect day, whenever you need to make one of these transitions, you just slow down in one of these wonderful thermals, make the transition, then you're back on the ridge, and you never turn. So the Tuscarora that we fly, from one end to the other, in round numbers, it's about 100 miles. So you can fly up and back down the ridge without ever circling, on a good day. Yes.
If your objective is to thermal off the ridge to come back to Fairfield, and that happens often late in the day, then you might be faced with what Dave was talking about earlier. You're on the ridge at 70 or 80 knots, and you come to someplace like Burnt Cabins, which is a relatively easy place to dig out and transition back to Fairfield. You may be faced with a situation where you're going to figure eight, you're going to find your thermal, you're going to figure eight up off the ridge, because at this point you may be too low to do a full 360. You want to try to not get drifted behind the ridge while you're doing this because of the sink behind the ridge. So you always be sort of working to the upwind side. If you're really lucky, you roll right into a 6-knot thermal. That happens on occasion. But most of the time, it's just a slow process, and you're working, trying to find it, get center, which is harder to do when you're making figure eights because you're driving yourself out of the thermal. So, and then you climb up to whatever altitude, either cloud base or whatever altitude you're comfortable, begin to move downwind towards Fairfield.
I have a couple things to add to that. One, if you've got a low energy state on the ridge, exactly what Dave said, you're looking to get higher. You're looking to make a transition. So you're looking for these rising pockets of air. When you're traveling really fast, you don't need them unless you're coming to a transition. You don't want them. And in fact, if you're traveling above your yellow arc speed, the definition of that is that that's the speed at below which you can't really do anything to injure your aircraft structurally. Above that speed, if you find an 8-knot thermal and you pull that stick, I mean, the description is that you may move any control surface 1/3 of its travel. If you get aggressive with one of these thermals, you can overstress your plane.
Yeah, I was wondering how you feel it if you're going, if you decide you want to live.
Very obvious.
You'll know. How do you feel the thermal today when you're just banging around Fairfield, right? You know how you feel the thermal.
I think, but they were saying that you're vibrating so much at low altitude. How do you notice
this
that
is
it's
more?
This
whatever,
is more.
Whatever you got adds more to it.
So one thing you'll notice on the ridge, your vario is going to be going up 5, down 5. It's going to almost the point where you ignore it.
That's right.
And your seat of the pants is going to be a better indication. As you enter a thermal, you're going like this, and then it will start to hover above zero and hang there for a while. And you see the pants may not notice the uplift, but your VSI will hang.
On these long ridge flights, how often do you get streeting along the ridge? You can climb up to cloud base and streak faster than on the ridge, maybe?
I don't know. I mean, if the ridge is working good, it's hard to beat it. I mean,
the streak is going to typically be in the perpendicular direction.
Yeah.
Right, it'll be.
Yeah.
So, take a street to the ridge.
That's right. So typically we're using, if there's cloud streets going on or lift streets going on, we're typically using them to cross the ridges, cross to the next ridge. Which is always a good thing too, and I think Mike's going to talk about it too. I will say one last thing about thermaling up off the ridge. Something that that you don't, unless you fly the ridge a lot, you don't think so much about this. But if you're in this position where you're trying to thermal up off the ridge, and you do this figure 8 pattern to try to make your initial foray into climbing off the ridge. What you're going to find is when you finally get high enough to make a complete circle. I mean, obviously, you've got a strong wind generally out of the west or northwest because that's how you're flying the ridge. Well, if you make your complete circle and you make it a constant bank circle or thereabouts, you're going to be drifting back over the ridge. And so oftentimes, what you really need to do is the guys that train in powered airplanes, they train on all these ground reference maneuvers. Good application of the ground reference maneuvers. So you really need to shallow out into the wind so that you actually carry yourself out away from the ridge again. And then as you start to come downwind, you need to increase the bank angle as you're coming around in that thermal that keeps you just out ahead of the thermal, and or just out ahead of the ridge, and that'll keep you in the thermal and keep you on the windward side of the ridge, so that if this thermal doesn't work out so good, you've still got the ridge as a backup. And the other thing that I'll throw in at this point, when you're trying to do this, either getting to the ridge or when you decide to leave the ridge and head back home, patience is oftentimes necessary. You'll get into a position where you pull up into this fantastic thermal that just knocked the living daylights out of you. You say, man, I got it now. You rack into this thermal, you do 2 turns, I'm 1,000 feet above the ridge. That's all I can get. And so you find out you're in this tremendous amount of turbulence, but you're sinking back down again. And you lost the thermal because there's no cloud there. So you're going through this process. It can be very tedious. So it's not always easy. And so what the tendency to do, especially if you're trying to go home, is say, well, I'm 1,000, 1,500, maybe even 2,000 feet above the ridge. I know that if I just point it downwind, I'm going to clear the ridges. That's true. The problem is, once you've cleared the ridges, you're going to be in tremendous sink. And again, you're going to be back to being a minute away from being on the ground. And so what I say about the patience aspect of this is that wait until you've clawed your way up to a substantial amount of altitude. And Mike is probably going to address what a substantial amount of altitude is. It depends on which ridge you're on and the conditions and all, but be patient with that. You're much better off struggling at this point for a little while to get yourself up above the ridge so that you've got a margin, once you get on the lee side of the ridge, a margin to find your next piece of lift that's going to get you home. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So just for an example, if you're at Burnt Cabins, you want to go home, you still got 30 knots perpendicular to the ridge. For you, and you're playing, how high makes you comfortable to come back to Fairfield?
Well, it's going to be unusual that you'll be able to climb high enough to make it in one fell swoop without some additional help. Like more lift on there. It's going to be unusual. Now, it's possible that you might get back into the wave if there was wave that day. So if you get into the wave, you get up to 10,000 feet or more. Hey, it's a piece of cake. I'm back at Fairfield. Now, in a more thermal environment, that we see, in the springtime, if you will, I don't like to cross the ridges back again until I got 5,000 feet. Now, will 4,000 feet work? Sometimes. Will 3,000 feet work?
Sometimes.
I did that one time.
But I think, to your point, 5,000 feet gets you to the next ridge near 5 Lakes. You can land at 5 Lakes.
Right. Yeah.
And you can make your decision there. But the other point is, if it's blowing 30 and you're circling, you're going 30 miles an hour to where you want to be. So stay in that thermal. If you're just casually flying, stay in the thermal and just, get blown downwind. It's a good thing.
But in general, 5,000 feet will give you enough altitude to get out of the sink zone, and then hopefully there's the next piece of lift, whatever that is.
When I started doing this, I extensively looked at the tracks that Mike and Bode, who were really the first ones to do it out of Fairfield. And what I started seeing was that they always came home virtually the same route, in that they crossed the valley at its narrowest point, which is north of 5 Lakes, is where that valley is the narrowest. Then I heard from Mike, well, there's always wave that you can catch right here. And you start to develop those things by looking at the traces that others are putting up.
Yeah, and it's almost invariably there's going to be lift at over 81. So if you come across from Burnt Cabins over Chambersburg, there's almost always lift there.
I don't want to talk too much about that stuff because I know Mike is going to have extensive discussion on that stuff, on the specifics of the ridge. That's why I'm not hitting very much. Okay, let me say a word about the wave. Okay, Mike gave a good dissertation on finding the wave, and obviously the wave is a good vehicle to get us out to the ridge, maybe get back into the wave and get us back. Good, all good things. However, sometimes the wave is not so good, and I'm going to talk about that on the next chart a little bit. But okay, so what's not good? Okay, weak wind and bad angles. We talked about that already, so I'm not going to spend too much more time on that. Low speed, especially at low altitude. Low and slow. I mean, how many aviation texts have you read that low and slow is bad? On the ridge, it's really bad. So don't be low and slow. Okay, unlandable terrain. I talked about that already too. You know, we fly, I mean, there's no two ways about it. When you're flying the ridge, we're going to fly over some unlandable terrain. And so if you're going to do that, it needs to be on a day when things are working well, a day when you've got some options. I'll throw one more option out that I didn't talk about much. You know, we talked about, you know, looking for places to land, remembering what's behind you, so you might have to reverse course and go back to there and land. One more option. You know, you've got to make an early decision on this, but depending on where you're flying, this may be a viable option, is to turn towards the ridge. I mean, I don't mean turn towards the ridge, but maybe come around the other way, but cross the ridge to the lee side. There may be better landing fields over there. You've got to know the ridge. You've got to know whether that's a good idea or not. So that may or may not be a good idea. It depends on the ridge. But that may be the only place where there's good landing fields. So just keep that idea in mind. Okay, wave again, sometimes. Okay, the reason I say sometimes, it's good, sometimes it's not so good, is because we get into a condition. Oh, well, I'll throw this up, talk about that in a minute. Okay, this famous quote from Carl Streetic. If it's not rough, the ridge isn't working good enough. Okay, so if you're ever out there and it's glassy smooth, be concerned. Okay, I thought I had another chart on this. Okay, I'm gonna wave. Okay, what happens to the wave sometimes? I thought I had a slide on this, but anyway, what happens to the wave? You know, the wave, our wave starts in the valley, the first valley to the east of the Allegheny Plateau. And essentially what happens is the wave sets up and it rebounds off the floor of the valley, and that's what starts the wave. So we've got all these ridges between us and there. And so the ridges all do something to the wave. It may be good, it may be not so good. And so each wave harmonic that you're on has different characteristics. In general, I mean, if you had a perfect textbook laboratory environment, you would have one obstacle, one mountain, and downwind of that mountain you would generate wave harmonics. And the first one, downwind of the obstacle, the peak, would be the strongest, and all the ones subsequently following that will be generally weaker. Okay, but that's not the way it works, because we've got all these other ridges between where the wave starts and where we are. And each one of those ridges has some impact on the wave. It may make it better, it may make it worse. So when we start out from Fairfield, we might be in this fantastic wave over Carroll Valley. And then we move on out to the next one, which is, you know, maybe a little bit beyond the quarry. It may be about as good, it may be better. It's generally similar, I would say.
Or non-existent.
Or non-existent. And then the next one out there, once we get out of our little hills here, that one's usually not so good. And so it's usually significantly less. And the one after that is typically not so good either, but it's usually there. But by the time we get out to the ridges just to the west of Chambersburg, that's a pretty good wave there. Those you know, that area there is usually a pretty good wave.
Can you point to that?
Yeah.
On the map, right?
Well, you're talking about broad. Mike's going to talk about it. Okay, Mike's going to talk more about that. Okay. But you know, we're basically crossing this valley. You know, we're crossing this valley here, and so there's a wave harmonic. It varies on the day, of course, but approximately every 4 miles or so, there's a wave harmonic. And so each one of those is going to be different. And so that's the point that I'm getting around to in a somewhat belabored fashion here is that sometimes that the descending part of the wave exactly lines up with the leading edge of the ridge. That's not good. So, because what happens is your wonderful ridge day is spoiled because the wave is crashing down onto the ridge, and it basically damps out the ridge lift. So you got no ridge lift. Now, on the ridges that we fly, for the most part, you don't see a lot of that. Sometimes you get that effect, but you don't see a lot of it. Where you do see it on an all too regular basis is down on the Massanutten. There's, you know, I used to be a member of that club down there, and there was a famous, famous day down there when these two guys went up in the K-21, and they immediately got into the wave. And so they're up there at 10, 12,000 feet in the wave, flying around in the K-21, and they're having a good old time. And they know that the forecast winds at ridge level are like 25 knots. And so they got kind of bored with flying around in the wave for an hour or so. So they said, well, let's go down and fly the ridge. And so they take their 12,000 feet, and they go screaming out of the sky, and they jump down to ridge level, slow down, and there is no lift. There's nothing at all.
I got real excited.
And so, like I said before, they were a minute away from landing, and they did. They landed right at the base on one of the most wonderful wave days they had. They landed right at the base of the Massanutten, and the wind at the surface is blowing 20 knots or so, and they're just kind of dumbfounded about this whole thing. And so the Massanutten Ridge is aligned just about perfect so that it doesn't happen all the time, but more often than you'd really like, the wave suppresses the ridge lift. So the point of all that is just be aware. Go ahead.
I just want to reinforce that perspective, is that many times when we're waiting to launch from the hang glider, just above Woodstock, while we're setting the gliders up, it will sound like freight trains just moving through, because the wave is not in, positioned off of the ridge, and then suddenly it'll get really quiet, and both sides, so it's not a thermal coming through. It'll be quiet for a good period of time, and then it'll start, the wave will shift again. And
that's exactly right. So what can you do about this? There's nothing you can do about it. You just have to be cautious about it. Like I said, luckily, there you go. Good thinking. But for the most part, the ridges that we fly in Pennsylvania are not so much subject to this phenomenon. But if you ever get down to the Massanutten, be cautious. It's kind of like dipping your toe in the swimming pool, wondering just how cold that water is. When you descend down onto the ridge, kind of feel your way down there before you really are going full throttle down the ridge, and just be aware of that phenomenon. Okay, so now what I want to do, and as an aside, this graphic was extracted from that program that I told you about, Topo USA. And so you've got 10 zillion zoom levels. You can zoom in or zoom out. And the resolution of this projector really doesn't do this justice. But
what is it on this map, Dave?
okay, this is
That's it.
the Massanutten.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
So, and that's right where we are. And so the reason I use this, I use the Massanutten for some of the examples I'm going to give you for two reasons. One, I didn't want to steal Mike's thunder about our local ridges. And two, the Massanutten is an excellent training ridge. I think somebody mentioned that before. And so why is it an excellent training ridge? Well, it's not super long, but it's substantial. It's 50 miles long, essentially. So when I was flying out of Front Royal a lot, our goal was to do a complete lap of the ridge in less than an hour. So you knew you were having a pretty good ridge day if you could do a complete lap in less than an hour. And it has some transitions on it, but they're not terribly challenging transitions. But it's enough to learn how to do transitions. So for our first sample transitions here, we've got two. The northern end of the ridge here is where you start. And so you're coming down this section of ridge. And your first transition is this one inside the red circle here. And so what you've got to do is you've got to transition slightly upwind to this piece of ridge here, which is called Short Mountain. And so it looks a little bit more intimidating on this graphic than it actually is. But this is generally not a tremendously difficult transition. And the reason is because in this gap here, there's typically not a lot of sink. So all you really need to do in general, if it's a reasonably good ridge day, is approaching this knob here, start slowing down. And so you slow down, and that will give you enough altitude to easily cross over to this section of ridge. Now, if the ridge is not real strong, you may have to reverse course and climb up above the ridge and get a little bit more altitude to make this transition. But normally, if we're having a pretty good ridge day, all you really have to do is slow down, turn into the wind, and float around this turn, and you're back in business again. So that's a relatively easy transition.
What's the distance? How far is that?
Oh, this is only about half a mile. This is only about half a mile.
Lower ridge to higher upwind, yes?
If the peak, okay, the front part of this ridge that you're running is slightly below this knob. And so this knob is a little bit higher, yeah.
Yeah, the top point of Short Mountain is about 2,800.
Right.
And it goes down to about 2,300 at the corner.
Yeah. So Short Mountain is a pretty good section of ridge. So you can run that pretty fast. And it's really good. Then when you get to the end of Short Mountain, you've got a transition, which this is about 1.5 miles. Now, going southbound, this is a piece of cake. And so why is it a piece of cake? Because you're going downwind.
Right.
And so not to worry until you're on your way back. But so you make this transition, and I'll say a little bit about making this transition. When you come off this knob and you head towards the ridge, we're at the fire department with a fire? Seriously? Okay, well, we're going to ignore that. So when you're making this transition, you're taking the shortest route to this ridge. But as you approach this ridge, you don't want to approach the ridge at a 90-degree angle, because you're traveling pretty fast, you're heading downwind, and if you approach the ridge at a 90-degree angle, you've got to do a pretty radical maneuver to keep from overflying the ridge and ending up on the lee side. So as you approach the ridge, you want to cut this angle to 45 or 30 degrees so that you've got a little bit more gradual transition. But this section of ridge is very nice, and it can be flown at high speed. Okay, so this is just another view of this is the three-dimensional view out of Topo USA again, but this is approaching the knob looking south. We're looking south, and this is the north end of Short Mountain here. So this is kind of what the view looks like.
Is the other side of the ridge also flyable in this case? If you get back to the other picture, please, before that. Yes, the one on the left side if you're going south.
So flying in here?
Yeah, is that flyable as well?
Okay, when I was flying out of Front Royal, this valley here, yeah, that's Fort Valley. We used to refer to it as the Valley of Doom. So this ridge, I have flown this ridge. This is not fun times. It can work. It can work. I know Bode's flown this. I don't know, Mike, have you flown that one?
I have not.
Okay. I've flown this. This is not fun. Let me just put it that way. So it can work, but it's got, in addition, it's slightly lower than this ridge, which impacts it. And in addition to that, the turbulence that comes off this ridge is messing with you as well. So all in all, if you need to desperately save yourself, it can work, but this is not something I'd recommend. There are some, but it's not fantastic either as far as places to land.
Hey, Dave, before
Yes.
you get off that slide.
Yes.
Talk about the valley that's between the knob up there.
Yes?
You know,
Oh,
the
in here?
forward ridge and the rear ridge, and why you want to fly on one, maybe not the other,
Well, okay.
with respect to topography.
So normally, when we fly the Massanutten, we're normally flying this front ridge, okay, which is slightly lower, and it you don't have any interference. There's nothing out in front of you. You got a big valley. The next ridge system is, I don't know, 10 miles, 7, 8, 10 miles to the west, and so the front ridge typically works pretty good. But what happens is, and this this graphic makes it look a little bit more distinctive than it really is. But when you're actually flying a sailplane down this ridge, up here at the north end, this valley is very obvious. But as you go further and further south, it starts to kind of blend together, and you don't really see so much of a distinction between the front ridge and the back ridge. So that by the time you're in this area here, you're flying on the high part of the ridge, and you just sort of gradually transition up to that, so that, so that about in this area here, the ridge actually has kind of an odd shape to it, so that if it's weak, it looks like you're not going to make it up to the top of that knob. If it's strong, then you're always up here at the highest part of the ridge, and it's a piece of cake. But is that kind of what you want to talk about?
Well, what I wanted to say was that, especially if you're northbound and you're on that higher, you're on the rear ridge, you notice there aren't any roads in there, and there are no fields to land in between those two ridges.
Yeah, there's no place to land.
There's no place to land between those two. And
Yeah.
if things start turning south on you, you may not have the energy to clear that front ridge.
Yeah, there's absolutely no place to land. Yeah, it's all trees. There's a fire trail. I've had, as an aside, and if we got any hikers or backpackers, I've hiked up to Signal Knob many times. It's a fantastic hike. Okay, here we are. We're just getting ready to come off the knob and transition make the downwind transition. And so it's pretty straightforward. All you have to do is fly off the end of the knob, head straight towards the downwind ridge, and then decrease your angle to 30 or 45 degrees. It's almost a no-brainer in typical ridge conditions.
So if you could go back just one slide, because I think I have something that may help you guys.
Here?
Go forward, right there. So that's a sea of trees, all that green, going back to the next bridge.
Yep.
But off on the lower right-hand corner, you see a sort of straight line, aqua. That's a power line.
Yeah.
Now, just on the other side of that, upwind, is right in there, there's an individual that owns a sailplane, and he has buried the power lines. So, and many times when you guys can't get back, that's where the guys in front will end up. That's a potential bailout field right there.
Yeah.
No power lines.
Yeah, power lines, when you're flying the ridge, especially if it's not working so good, you really have to be attuned with this, because many of these ridges have either power lines or towers that stick up. The typical towers are cell towers. Cell towers are not tremendously tall, but they stick up above the ridge. So you need to be attuned with and they're starting to build wind turbines on some of the ridges too. And we haven't been impacted too much by that yet, but I think it's kind of coming.
Over near Petersburg, they've started to do that.
Okay.
And I think that ridge could be impacted.
Yeah. Okay, so now we've got kind of two situations that are They're illustrated here. When we're flying the Massanutten, when we cross 211, this is where we typically cross. This is a very insubstantial gap here. And essentially all you need to do is slow down a little bit and you'll float right across this gap in the ridge. So it's really not a tremendous amount of challenge. Now I drew this little yellow line in here because this is not a way that we typically fly the Massanutten, but it's a good example of other ridges that you might encounter. This gap here is on the order of 3.5 miles. The actual measurement here I got was 3.79 miles across this gap. This is a pretty substantial gap, and unless there's some miracle thermal right in the middle of the gap, you're not going to be able to fly straight across this. So you've got to do something. So what are your choices? Okay, you thermal up while you've got good ridge here or here, depending on whether you're north or southbound. You've got to thermal up off the ridge and get enough altitude to cross this gap. So how much do you need? Well, 200 feet per mile. So on the order of 600 or 700 feet above the ridge oh, that was bad. Sorry about that. So, yeah, so 600 or 700 feet above the ridge is what you typically need to cross a gap like that, and then you're back in business again as soon as you get back on the other side.
Dave, what about that upwind ridge is going to cause, and that depiction you got there, the upwind ridge is going to likely cause massive sink in the middle of that gap.
That's a possibility as well.
So keep all that stuff in mind as you're deciding whether 600 feet is enough or not.
That's right. That's always a possibility. And again, I'm trying to think in terms of generic stuff. I'm really not trying to teach you how to fly the Massanutten here. I just picked out the Massanutten because it's got some good examples on it. But every ridge that you fly, all the ones that Mike's going to talk about, they've each got some little quirks that you're only going to find out after you've done this a few times, or you've talked to somebody like Mike that's very experienced in flying these things.
In that situation, in reality, would you just jump to the smaller ridge and then transition it that way and not try to make bigger gaps?
Well, like I said, we typically, when we're flying the Massanutten, this is the front part. You can't see it because we're zoomed in here, but this is where we're normally flying.
Right, but if that was just a smaller ridge, would it be wise to try and go to a smaller one that might not be working than jump the gap?
Well, it really depends on the situation. I'd have to look at the exact ridge that you're talking about, but yeah, I mean, there are situations where, and when you see the Tuscarora, when Mike starts talking about the Tuscarora, you're going to see some of the transitions, you're going to see some of the techniques that we use, and we kind of do that in a couple of places.
I think I mean, he's using this as an example of how you might approach a big transition. There are transitions on the bridge system that, if you did that, you might be on a small ridge that goes to nowhere, and you get jammed up in a small valley, or moving into a valley that's all full of trees. So I would say typically you would end up, if you know that that's the main ridge system that you want to be on, you'd figure out how to transition there rather than do something creative.
Okay, now this is an example of a much trickier transition. Okay, this is the south end of the Massanutten. This is the ski bowl at the south end of the Massanutten Ridge. And this ridge works really good. I mean, all this in here works really good. And when you're heading southbound, you scarcely notice this. You've got a slightly lower ridge, and you're climbing up. This is the high point on the Massanutten here at Laird's Knob. And as you get here, if you're southbound, you hardly notice this. You go blowing by this, and you easily transition over to here. It's almost seamless. It doesn't look like it's a big gap or anything. And then you're here, and so now we got to turn around. We got to go north. Okay, so when we turn around to go north, what happens is the ridge here is higher than it is here. And so the ridge slowly descends into this area here. And so you got a couple choices here. So if it's a really strong ridge day, really all you got to do is slow down and you'll have enough altitude to get up here. No problem. If there's good thermals going on, then somewhere right around in here, you pull up in a thermal and you may not even have to turn. You might just have to slow down in this thermal and it'll carry you up and back around the knob. Now, I've been in a couple situations. One time I was out here flying with Bode, and Bode was behind me back in here somewhere. And I got here and I got stuck. I couldn't get up. And so Bode marked a thermal back here, and I doubled back and I pulled up into his thermal, and it only took a couple turns in the thermal, and we're good to go. But I definitely needed a real thermal to get around this knob. Then there was another time, several years before that, there was no thermal. There was no thermal. The ridge was working okay. It was working okay, but it was not fantastic. And I will say, not recommended, but it is possible to make this transition below the level of this knob, go around this knob and end up on this ridge, and then you're back in. That is not for the faint of heart. Can be done, but not particularly pleasant.
You just stair-step your way back up.
Yeah, that's what you need to do. But but going around that knob below the level is eye-opening. Okay, so now we're back to Short Mountain again. So we kind of alluded to the fact that we've got this 1.5 mile gap. And so this is kind of typical of a situation you'll find yourself on many ridges. 1.5 miles doesn't sound like much. But remember, we talked about what's good criteria for being out there on the ridge? 20, 25, 30 knots. Okay, so that 20 or 25 or even 30 knots that we've been enjoying all day long, that's been allowing us to fly this ridge, we now have to turn our glider straight into the teeth of that wind. So we got a 30-knot headwind to fly this 1.5 miles. Okay, you'll notice that, keep hitting the wrong button. You'll notice that the height of this ridge is pretty similar to this. They're very close, within 100 feet maybe. We cannot afford to lose very much altitude when we're making this transition, which means that we've got to have some altitude above this ridge to make this transition. So on a really good ridge day, it's possible, once again, when you're back in this area here, just start slowing down. And once you get well above the ridge, we talked about, slow is not so good. In a case like this, if you're getting up to 5, 6, 7, 8, 900 feet above the ridge, 50 knots is not so bad anymore. So because all you're trying to do is you're trying to maximize your altitude above the ridge. And so then you can actually slow down enough to put yourself maybe 1,000 feet above the ridge, and then you can make this transition. Sometimes that's not enough. Or sometimes the ridge isn't working good enough to let you get that far above the ridge. Okay, in that case, you got to do something else. And again, the typical way we make that transition is you're looking for a thermal. So back in this area, you're coming to this situation, so you've got to think ahead. So back in this area here, you're looking for that thermal. So when you feel that thermal, turn into that thermal yourself up, maybe even, if you want to be real comfortable, maybe even 2,000 feet above the ridge. If you're not, which is not tremendously high. I mean, the ridge is less than 3,000 feet. So, 2,000, you thermal up to 5,000 feet, then you've got this made. And that's the comfortable way to do that.
So if you decided to go out after you got to, let's say, 9,000 feet,
yep.
you try, you jump across, and you don't make it, would you come back?
Okay, that's a good question.
Maybe.
That's a good question, and that's true, maybe. Okay, so remember, if you turn back, it's always going to be easier to go back than it is ahead, because your 30-knot headwind turns to a 30-knot tailwind. So you normally have that option, and typically, I won't say always, but typically, you know, especially this ridge here, typically the ridge will work slightly below the level of the peak. So if you arrive here a little bit low, you know, you can work your way back up to the peak and try it again. But it's best to make the decision a little bit earlier so you don't run into that situation.
I was going to say, I mean, if in that circumstance you plow through the sink going upwind, you're 300 feet below the top, and you go, oh no, this isn't going to work. You do a 180, you're now flying back through the same sink, and you may end up well down on the ridge where the only savior you got is thermaling up off of it. And in that situation, it doesn't look like there's much to land in, so it's a circumstance of, do I get lucky and find a thermal, or am I in the trees?
Yeah, the thing to think about again, I'll emphasize patience. Because when you're here, you've got lift. You've got good, solid ridge lift. And it might even be, you know, again, this is situationally dependent, but you might even double back, head back south. Like, you know, 3 miles back, maybe you remember a really good thermal, but you thought that was too early. Hey, maybe you need to go back to that thermal and thermal back up that ridge. Be patient about this. Don't try to force yourself across this gap when you have inadequate altitude. Do whatever it takes to put yourself in a position where you can make this jump. So again, be patient. It varies. Every day is different out there on the ridge. It may be that you've got to tediously, you know, soar back and forth along this ridge a little bit, waiting for a thermal to develop. You know, it just depends on how strong the wind is and how poor the thermals are, you know. But just be patient when you have to do a transition like this.
One of Dave's points early on was, is this a more hazardous sort of flying than our normal flying? And I think his answer was, well, maybe. This is where you can, and as you gain more experience, that it worked every other time, and you just go ahead and try to blow right across the gap, and then it doesn't work, that's when you can get into trouble. So his point about patience is just huge.
Not only patience, but be flexible.
Yeah, that too.
Hey, Dave, before you get off this slide, that book I'm passing around has a lot of examples of different ridge shapes that the wind is striking. And when you have a ridge shape that's very shallowly ascending, even though it goes high, the ridge lift there isn't so good. So this ridge is reliable because of the topographic shape of that ridge.
So actually, one additional thing is just to my left of that slide is the New Market Gap.
Yeah.
And that's really the point of no return. If you go past the New Market Gap going north, the landing fields are so far out, even for you guys, I don't know if you could really make it. Yeah. So if you're coming back, you are pretty much forced to head south or to track back and forth and find a thermal to climb up.
Yeah, and you'll see that when you fly this ridge, that's very obvious to you. So that's just something else. Again, you've got to modify your flying depending on the day. If it's a good solid ridge day, then you don't have to worry about that so much. If it's not so good and you've got solid trees for 2 miles, okay, you've got to fly a little bit differently.
Here's another example for you. I mean, you could, the days that we typically fly are Cavoo and they're gorgeous. But in a place like Ridge Soaring or Mifflin County, you can launch with a cloud deck 1,000 feet above the ridge top, and you can fly a very long distance and go down to Cumberland and pick up the wave, right? But if in the meantime you're doing a bunch of different transitions and you're under the overcast, while there are thermals generated, they're not very strong, nor do they go very high. So, but a lot of flights start out that way out of those 2 airports up there, that it's overcast and they fly out of it going southbound. And it's very easy in transitions like this, and there are a number of them up there on that part of the system, to get caught in a trap where you'll end up down the ridge, below ridge top substantially, and within seconds of landing out, and you're lucky to find a thermal, but then you're in for 25 minutes of grinding around in the scariest stuff you've ever been in your life.
So be patient. Okay, and then I just threw this one in at the end because this is a piece of cake. So this is this is coming off the north end. This is coming off the north end of Short Mountain. It's not very far, and you're going downwind. This is really a no-brainer, and you're pretty happy to do this. So you're just making this short jump, and then you're running right back down the ridge again. So I won't even spend a lot of time.
And the ridge descends from one Aussie peak
Yeah.
down, so.
Yeah, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about that. Okay, so just a couple, we've talked about most of this stuff already, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We talked about the wind changing direction, suppression, turbulence, clouds of precipitation, and upwind obstacles. So just a couple of examples. Okay, I did use the Tuscarora here, but I'm not going to talk about specifics. But what I was trying to show on this graphic is that this is the ridge. You know, these big long arrows, this is the ridge. And you can see how when you're down on the southern part of the ridge, a west wind is not so bad. When you're on the northern part of the ridge, a west wind is not very good at all. So what are we looking at? You know, like 310 is kind of ideal for the full length. You know, the extreme northern stuff, you know, when you get out towards Blairstown, you know, a more northerly direction, you know, 3-3, even straight north is good up at Blairstown. Straight north is pretty bad if you're on the southern part of the ridge. So, you know, so basically, you know, here you are, you're flying along the ridge, and depending on
My 747, Schleicher 747.
F-86. F-86. Yeah.
F-86.
But okay, this is my wave suppression graphic. We talked, I think we talked about this ad infinitum, but basically that's what you're looking at. So it comes crashing down on the ridge, and you know you're suppressed right here, and your wonderful ridge day just kind of went to pieces. I just threw this abode picture. I just threw this in. Mike talked a little bit about this. Sometimes it's just a wonderful blue, sunny day out on the ridge. Sometimes not. So this is kind of a view that you could be looking at on the ridge. And so with decreased visibility means you need to be that much more alert for other people that are out there flying on the ridge. So just keep that in mind if the conditions are looking like that. Okay, one slide on upwind obstacles. Okay, this is the piece of this ridge that we typically fly on. This is the southern end of the Tuscarora, and so there's this piece of ridge that's called Dickey's Mountain, and when you get into this area here, by the way, this little valley here is chock full of big-ass trees. So there's no landing going on in here. So before you fly into this area, you need to have a good ridge or thermal day.
Okay, where do we put our turn point?
We put our turn point right here. So our turn point's right here. Okay. So what happens is when we get down into the, whoops, God, I keep hitting the wrong button. When we get down into this area here, it's usually very turbulent. And that turbulence is caused by the wind flowing over the upwind ridge. And so this ridge still works, but not quite as good as it would if this wasn't here. And also it is really turbulent. So typically what I try to do, if I have the luxury, if there's thermals going on, I'll slow down a little bit. I'll slow down a little bit and pull up into the thermals, just kind of bump the thermals out here. And then once I've made the turn point, you know, and I reverse course, then I know how good it's going to work in here. Then I can go ahead and increase speed and go throttle the firewall again, you know, heading up towards McConnellsburg. But anyway, just wanted to throw that in. And I think Mike's talked about weather, so I don't need to talk about that. How fast to fly? I'll just say a couple words about that. Because we talked about the various effects of, you know, flying high, flying low. So how fast do you fly? Well, you get down on the ridge, and you, like dipping your toe in the swimming pool again, you see how it's working. And so what altitude are you comfortable with? That's going to vary from person to person, but, you know, like if you can comfortably fly a couple hundred feet above the ridge at a reasonable speed, you know, maybe 80 knots, okay, that's pretty much okay. Now, if you're trying to measure, like if we're in a contest and we send an experienced guy out to the ridge, what kind of a ridge day is it? So they're going to give us a number. And so what that number is going to mean is if you're just above the ridge how fast can you fly and not descend? Okay, and so it might be an 80-knot day, which is kind of like, well, that's an okay day. Might be a 100-knot plus day. That means it's really working good. If he says it's a 60-knot day, we're not too happy about that. But anyway, so that's how fast to fly.
Usually someone will make a comment after they've launched, and you won't be the first one to launch under these circumstances, so there will be reports coming back to you. And periodically during the day, you'll hear others reporting wind strengths, directions.
I think it's important to note when you talk about how fast to fly, that when you're 50 to 100 feet above the ridge, you're going to be flying the contour of the ridge basically in ridge lift. So you're going to be maintaining your 80 or 90 knots, call it 80 knots, and you're going to fly along at whatever that gives you above the ridge. And if the ridge goes down, you're going to go down. When it comes back up, you're going to come back up. What you need to not do and be really conscious of is fly the constant altitude. So you're at 1,800 feet and the ridge drops down to 1,700 feet. You're going to slow down to stay at 1,800 feet. Before you know it, you're going to be at 50 knots and you're in real trouble when you're that low. So the airspeed indicator is probably the most important instrument on your instrument panel when you're flying the ridge.
Yeah, that's good points. If you're flying the ridge the way you probably ought to, you're doing exactly what Dave said. You're essentially flying the contours of the ridge, and the ridge is not exactly at the same altitude all the time. Sometimes it's a lot different, sometimes it's just a little bit different, but you're essentially migrating up and down a little bit. And then again, depending on what you're trying to do, if you're trying to make a transition or if you're coming to a section that doesn't have very good landing opportunities, then you might be climbing up off the ridge a little bit. You might be climbing in a little thermal opportunity, and then you'll be descending back down onto the ridge after that. But, you know. Okay, we pretty much talked about landing, so I'm not going to talk about that too much more. Okay, we said it, we kind of alluded to this. Let me just emphasize this again. If you're flying the ridge and you have to land, it's happening fast. You know, you have got to be thinking ahead. You can't just all of a sudden find out that the ridge is not working and say, well, whoops, I guess I better look for someplace to land. That is not going to work. You have got to be looking at all along the ridge. You've got to be looking at the fields lining up all along on the ridge and what's going to be good. Okay, beware of the slope. Okay, the slope is the most important thing about picking one of these fields. And so there's an infinite number of possibilities on this, so I'm not going to try to talk about them all, but I will say that it's quite possible that you could be in a situation where you're not going to be able to land into the wind because the slope is going to be a more significant consideration. So just be aware of that. Okay, yeah, I just said that you may not be able to land into the wind. It just depends on where we're flying, and it depends on how the fields are aligned. Ideally, you're going to pick the only flat field out there and land into the wind, and everything's going to be just fine. But you might have to land crosswind. You might even have to land downwind. You know, it just depends on the slope of the field.
The slope may very well be wingtip to wingtip.
And that's pretty much the worst thing that you can have, is because you know, if it's an extreme situation like that, well, it's a good chance you got a good chance of catching a wingtip on the upslope side, which results in a ground loop, and you might break your sailplane doing that. So just be aware of that, you know. But as you get away, try to keep enough altitude, especially if the ridge is starting to deteriorate, that you've got enough altitude to fly away from the ridge to the flatter fields. Clearly, the fields that are closest to the ridge may not be flat at all. So keep that in mind. I mentioned this before. It may be better. Now, of course, you've got to make the decision a little bit earlier. It may be better to hop over to the lee side. There may be better landing fields. Just keep that in mind. And that's all I got.
Thanks, Dave. That's all good stuff. Water ballast is good for many reasons. One is you fly faster for the same amount of sink in your glider. So that from the ridge, you can typically fly 10 or 15 knots faster in the same conditions with water ballast. Secondly, it's tremendously helpful for upwind transitions. When you're having to jump upwind a couple miles to get to the next ridge, it allows you to make that transition with considerably less altitude. And third, which is real important too, water ballast makes for a much more comfortable ride. The gust turbulence is dampened out by the water. If you got a 9-pound wing loading versus a 7-pound, your G hits you're taking in the cockpit are going to be proportionally that much lower. And your airframe too. So if you're flying a long ridge flight, you can get fatigued very quickly without water ballast. I mean, you're getting slammed hard. Positive, negative G hits. If you're flying with a good load of water, it's much smoother and more comfortable. In fact, I won't fly the ridge for more than a few hours without water. It's just too hard on the body. It really is. So water is a good thing. And I encourage you to practice flying with water. With my glider, I fly with like 22 gallons, I think is the sweet point, because it gives me enough wing loading that I can upwind penetrate really well. It's comfortable, yet it doesn't seem to negatively impact the climbability. I can climb really well with 22 gallons of water, although I could carry 30 gallons if I wanted to. This is a beautiful wave day. Again, we've looked at a shot like this. You can see the wave bands, the clouds underneath. It's just gorgeous. Now let's take a cross-sectional look at that wave day. Imagine a line being cut, say, from Petersburg or from Cumberland or Altoona, southwest, parallel to the wind, looking back toward Fairfield. What would it look like? And I created this schematic recently with the intention that it shows everything that's going on in a simplified form. What you see here, looking on the ground first, is the plateau out beyond Cumberland or out beyond Petersburg, and it's typically 3,000 or 4,000 feet. You've got turbulent convective air coming across at 20 knots. It drops down off the plateau, gives you ridge lift. Up above, you got the laminar layer in the wave zone. Winds are typically increasing with altitude. The wind comes off the plateau, drops down off the plateau into the first valley, and you get the spring effect. And it's analogous to a mechanical spring, is what the wave is. It basically bounces, and then as the wind goes down, or as it proceeds downwind, it continues to bounce. And you've got the spring effect, and that's what gives you the 20, the 15, 20, 25 basic wave bars heading downwind. And you can fly these wave bars just like you fly a ridge in this zone right here. That's the primary wave lift, secondary wave lift zone, and then the tertiary is going back. And again, if you're looking at Cumberland or Petersburg or Altoona, typically Fairfield's about 10 to 13 bands back. And you can fly all 13 bands all the way up to the main ridge if you want to. I've done that a few times. It takes about 2 hours. You've got to go through about 12 wave bands to do that. And typically when you're flying the wave, you want to be I find the sweet spot for wave flying is 8,000 to 10,000 feet, right in this zone right here, in any one of these bars. You want to be a safe distance above the clouds. You don't want to be too close to the clouds for clearance issues, and it just gives you a little more safety in terms if the wave with the wave lift drops, you can penetrate through that and get in a strong wave lift again. But if you go up too high, 12 or 14,000 feet, all of a sudden now the wind velocity is getting higher and higher, and you're having to crab at such an angle that it slows down your ground speed to the point where you're not making good progress toward your goal.
And the heavies are going a lot faster too.
Well, they are. So 8 to 10 is the sweet spot. Sometimes if you're further out west in the primary, 10 to 12 I find is the sweet spot in wave. And the only reason to go higher than that in wave, if you're trying to go cross country, is if you're trying to make a difficult upwind jump. If you know you're going to have to jump upwind to try to pick up the next wave bar, which might be 4 to 6 miles away from you, you might want to climb to 12 or 14 and then turn into the wind and fly 100 knots straight upwind going to the next wave bar.
Mike, real quick, I'd like to comment on Paul's point. The heavies over top of Fairfield, 10,000 feet. I mean, they're coming in. So if you're flying wave and you like wave, think about getting a transponder. they'll see you with a transponder. So they're looking down in their panels, they're not looking out the windows.
Or fly next to Danny.
Yeah, you can fly next to me, I have a transponder. Yeah. Big sky theory only works until it doesn't work.
The beauty of this system is that, you know, these wave bars cover a lot of area. I mean, if, again, you go back to this shot, you can fly that wave system anywhere in this area here. It's well marked, it provides fantastic lift. On a day like this, you know, it's very possible to lay at a 1,000K triangle flying all wave if you've got the markers and if the system stays stable. If, a lot of ifs there, I have to, you know, 2 or 3 ifs in one sentence, but it's just an amazing system for flying cross country. A couple other comments about this. Typically when you're flying cross country and wave, you're flying up in 8, 10, 12,000 foot zone. If you want to go upwind, you simply climb up the wave, in the wave lift zone. You turn, you run straight upwind, diving through the sink. If there's 8 knots up on this side of the wave lift, there's 8 knots down on that side, trust me. And it shows up as 12 down, you know, when you're in your glider, because you got to add your sink to that. So it takes typically 2,000 to 4,000 feet of altitude to dive through that sink and get to the next wave band. Sometimes it takes 6,000 feet, and sometimes you can't do it. And I've tried that. You know, sometimes I started at 14,000 feet over Fairfield trying to get to the next upwind wave band, and I couldn't do it because I was diving into that cloud up ahead of me. Sometimes the wind speed is so high you just can't do it. And typically, if the wind speed in the wave zone that you're flying in is 30 to 45, sometimes 50 knots, upwind transitions aren't too bad. If it goes above 50 knots, upwind transitions are big problems, and they just simply, you can't do it. So that's why that 50 knot point on the sounding is an important one to keep track of.
Hey, Mike.
Yeah.
Just a rule of thumb, how fast do you fly when you're doing your straight upwind transition? Dry glider, 12,000 feet, flown 50.
Airspeed, typically 100 knots, going against the wind.
Yeah. It's not a McCready situation.
No, you're well off.
Yeah,
you're punching through a 40 knot headwind. You want to have 60 knots over the ground, or if it's a 50 knot headwind, you gives you 40 knots over the ground. You know, which is you've got to have that to get to the next bar.
Eric, I typically do it a little bit differently. When you first start leaving the wave bar you're in, the sink is not so great. So I'll travel at a slower speed to keep my altitude up and then increase as the sink starts, because you're just not making much headway.
And you find that a straight perpendicular attack is better than trying to...
Absolutely. You want to go straight through that sink, get through on the shortest possible distance you can.
Just like in a ridge, you have ridges that aren't dead parallel to each other. We have differing width valleys in different places, and that means sometimes you can travel along this wave bar and make a forward jump at a narrower place.
Yeah, if it's marked.
So it's something, it's something you have to watch for.
Which is when you're that high, you need to keep in mind of your true airspeed versus indicated, and that your red line goes down.
I want to talk about 4 safety items related to wave flying. The first is don't fly into clouds, and ask Paul to explain what I mean over lunch. That's too long of a story for right now. Treat these wave clouds that form under the wave as though it's trees and hard terrain. That's how you should treat it. And you should be flying over it like you're flying over trees and hard terrain. You know, you treat it just like a ridge. You don't want to fly into it. And when you're making an upwind transition, watch the cloud. If you can see you're sinking into it, immediately pull up from that 100 knot dive you're making, pull up and then turn and go back. Because once you turn around, now you've got a 40, 50 knot tailwind, and your LD over the ground is probably 150. And you're going to be back into the lift immediately. I mean, very quick. It'd be very rare to abort and fall out of the wave. It can happen, but if you make that decision before you hit the cloud, you can be back, climb up again, and try it once again. So just be aware of that. The second thing is these gaps and these holes. You got to be very careful they don't close up. If you're flying between 2 wave clouds here, the gap can close and you get trapped on top with the obvious problems. But if you think about what's happening when the gap closes, what that means is more moisture is moving in from upwind to downwind underneath you. There's a moisture layer of air crossing below you. So that means is you'll see the upwind gap start to close before your gap closes, the gap here above. And if that happens, then start watching the downwind gap, because if your gap closes and you can't get through it, you can almost always turn downwind and there's a downwind gap. And if you look, if on wave days, if you look at that, it's always fewer gaps upwind than there are downwind. So the bailout position is if your gap closes unexpectedly and you're trapped on top, look downwind for bailout options. You'll most likely see gaps and holes down there. Fly downwind, you can very easily go downwind, descend through the gap there. Now you might be in a landout situation because you could be 10 miles downwind without a good way to get back, but that's certainly better than being trapped on top.
Could be in another state.
Or it could be over the Atlantic Ocean if you really screw up. But that's two. Just don't be aware of the clouds, stay clear of the clouds, and be careful of the gap closing. The third is traffic avoidance, fly with the transponder, as Danny says. But once you're above the clouds, you got to constantly be scanning. And then obviously the issue of climbing through this zone right here. You know, as you're entering the lift and immediately climbing through the cloud zone, you know, there's a good chance you're going to be violating cloud clearance according to the FAA. You know, but we all have to admit it. You know, the normal glider flight, you do violate. I say you. Most glider pilots violate cloud clearances. I, of course, never do. You guys probably don't either, I'm sure. But if I did violate cloud clearances, I would do it with the minimum possible exposure. So once you climb out and get it in front of this wave here in front of the cloud, that's typically 6, 8, 10 knots. Punch up through that as quick as you can to get up on top. And obviously, when you're in that zone, keep your eyes outside the cockpit looking for traffic. Big pieces of metal coming through the sky at you.
Cloud clearances above 10,000 feet change dramatically in the horizontal distance. They go to a mile from that cloud. So if that cloud deck, if that wave cloud is above 10,000 feet, you've got a serious issue if you continue up in front of it.
The last item I want to talk about with regard to safety is V&E and how it changes with altitude. As you go higher and higher, your indicated airspeed is faster and faster relative to true airspeed, and you can exceed your V&E if you're not careful. Now, 14,000 feet, I'm very comfortable with my glider flying 100 knots. And I rarely go more than 100 knots in wave. There's no reason to. But just be aware that when you're up at 14 or 16,000 feet, depending on your glider where the V&E is, you could exceed it. You need to look at your manual to figure that out. And I think those are the only safety items I had.
Mike, is there a frequency that you would switch to and talk to some of the controllers? When I was in Frederick, when we did some wave, I always connected with Potomac Creek and told them what I was. Is that something that we do in Fairfield? Do we talk with some?
If we fly below 18,000 feet, flight level 180.
No, but just to see the big planes coming there.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I personally do not switch to air traffic control frequencies. I instead just look very carefully and watch for traffic. I know where traffic's coming from, I think, when I go through different zones. You know, we typically are looking for incoming traffic to Dulles. That's the real threat.
And again, I mean, I can't emphasize it twice now. Transponder is critical. I've been flying on a couple of occasions with Mike when we've been doing these early flights down opposite Dulles on the ridge south of Harper's Ferry. And at 3,000 feet, a small business airplane, as I come out of a turn in a thermal, looking upwind, up the valley, up to the west, a small business airplane is doing a 90-degree bank away from me. So either his TCAS went off, or ATC is telling him he's got a glider because I'm squawking the glider code, something. So it's flying where we do is a great thing to have.
I won't belabor this too much more, but down towards, well, it can happen in lots of places, but you know, one experience in particular down by Winchester. You know, the wave is typically good up there, and no matter how well you look outside your airplane, you can't see behind. And I've been in the wave down there, and I saw a Learjet climb up behind me. we had like miles worth of clearance, which that's not that much. And it could have easily have been less than that. And so he's like climbing like a banshee, you know, coming up from behind me, and you know, I can't see him. So without a transponder, that's something you got to be aware of. I don't have the ultimate solution here. Transponders are good, but just be aware you can't see behind you.
I've also had that experience with a Citation or Learjet, very low on the ridges. Maneuvering to go into Dulles.
Question?
So, yeah, about the convection layer. If the wave is really set up and robust, can it compress the, can it pass down below the cloud base?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, how we climb into wave is typically you're on the ridge, you thermal up under this cloud here to cloud base without blowing your clearances, obviously. And then you move forward, and as soon as you move in front of the cloud, below the cloud, you can pick up the ridge, or the wave. The wave dips down typically a couple hundred feet below cloud base, normally. And so we move forward, you get into wave, and then you can ride the wave right up the face of the cloud.
Mike, can you talk about to the upwind side of the lenticular cloud?
Well, these are not lenticulars. These are what we call roll clouds or rotor clouds or wave clouds. The lenticulars would be higher up.
Sometimes that thermal you're climbing, and I like to think, you know, years ago when I started doing it, I talked to Mike about how do you make this transition from thermal to ridge up into the wave. I was taught you got to buy wave, you got to tow up into it. But the truth of the matter is that there are some thermals that are so strong, I like to think that they buck the wind. And so they interrupt that with that wave flow, and you can climb up in the thermal in certain thermals and get out in front of them.
One thing about these clouds down here, notice I put that arrow in. That's a very important dynamic to be aware of, and that these roll clouds are called roll clouds because they roll. And if you look at time-lapse photography, you'll see a tremendous circular motion of those. Basically what's happening is this high-velocity laminar flow is setting up a circular motion in this cloud. So the downwind half of the cloud has heavy sink under it. The upwind half of the cloud has heavy lift, or strong lift. So if you're coming across the bottom of that cloud from the moving upwind, be prepared for extreme turbulent downdrafts on this side here. And then it improves in the middle, and then updrafts on the upwind side. So you just got to be aware of that dynamic.
Mike, I think another point, if you're planning long distance wave flights, it's good to be aware of last landing time, sunset and all of that.
It is indeed.
You're up at 18,000 feet. It's quite light, but as you know, you can, coming down, especially if you don't want to damage your gel coat of your glider and do a gentle descent, you can arrive when it's really quite dark at home.
When planning a long flight, I always mark and remember the sunset, local sunset, so I'm down well before that. Okay, let's move on now and talk about some planning and looking at long flights from Fairfield, in particular early starts. How do we get out of there early? This is, again, back to our map showing Fairfield, and if early morning wave works, which is what's demonstrated here, you tow up to 5,000 feet just west of Fairfield, you release, you find 3 or 4 knots, which is what I've got right there. Climbing up, the morning sun is rising out to the east, you're zigzagging back and forth. Now you've got 8,000 or 10,000 feet, what do? Here are the options. We often do is start heading southwest down the Shenandoah Valley, because the wave is often well marked going down there. It's strong. You can see the markers well to the south. Upwind is often excessive clouds. You can't see the gaps. So we often head southwest, getting down into the Shenandoah Valley, often as far as Massanutten Peak, sometimes further west. And then from there, you've got the option of either doubling back in the wave and heading back north to dive down on the Pennsylvania Ridge system, or going straight upwind in the wave to get out to the main ridge. And we've done both of those options. Another option is, if you're sitting there at Fairfield at 10,000 feet, is to go straight upwind. And there you just basically dive straight into the wind to the next bar. You climb, you dive straight again, you climb, you dive straight again. You can, in fact, if you do it about 10 times, 12 times, you're at Altoona. And it takes about 2 hours to do that. But you can go upwind. I find you average about 30 miles an hour over the ground, doing the dive, climb, dive, climb, dive, climb on a typical wave day. So in 2 hours you can be at Altoona, and then you can go left or right to fly the main ridge. Very often at Fairfield, you climb up. You can then often take just 1 or 2 jumps, go down onto the Tuscarora Ridge. Another option is to head north up through the Carlisle Valley and then dive down onto the Montanga Ridge to go further east. And then notice the dotted line here. This is a route that we've started to explore but have never successfully figured this out, and that is wave does work, particularly on northwest and north-northwest days, out into the Harrisburg Valley. It is possible, no doubt, to fly wave across Harrisburg and drop directly down into Hawk Mountain to fly the Blairstown Ridge, but we've never successfully done that. But it's something yet to explore and figure out.
I've crossed the Harrisburg Valley and wave and gone to the Mantango.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yeah, a long time ago.
Yep, so it has been done.
Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, that's something I've wanted to do but have not yet done. I think because of on northwest days, ridge, the wave just does not work well at Fairfield. I think the hills upwind of us are disruptive, and it kind of knocks the wave apart. And therefore, it's hard to get initial climbs and get out across there. But those are basically the options you have in early morning wave. If the wave doesn't work, which is often the case, and in fact this year the wave rarely worked early morning for us, you end up dropping. One option is to drop down onto the drop down onto the High Rock Ridge and head down the South Mountain, cross Harper's Ferry, head down Blue Ridge, jump upwind as you approach Front Royal, and then fly the Massanutten. We do that a lot. That's a typical day for us.
I think you need to caveat that, Mike. That's not something that the beginning ridge pilot should not try that ridge.
Yeah, well, further down, absolutely. The High Rock Ridge works very nice.
It's still not the best.
Well, the
Harper's Ferry is probably what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I'm talking about the whole thing. The whole thing is it's not as good as if you had the opportunity to throw yourself at the ridge in Mifflin County. That would be the most ideal.
Or Front Royal.
Or Front Royal, sure, but someplace other than the High Rock Ridge. It's you got P40 to deal with. You got you're lower you're lower there. Well, maybe later in the day it's stronger. We're always on this week in the morning. So.
But he's assuming here if the wave doesn't work and there's no thermal, it's still early in the day, this is the place how we start.
Right, I'm just making a comment.
Yeah, it is a tricky ridge. You got to be careful. Again, I find the High Rock element of it pretty comfortable, but further south, it's a tricky ridge. Once you get south of Harper's Ferry, the Blue Ridge, you can't run it like a normal ridge. You have to treat it more like ridge-assisted thermal flying. It's a long way out the landable fields when you're flying the Blue Ridge, and the Blue Ridge is a low ridge. I mean, it's got elevation to it, but the slope is not very great. So you're a long way from those landable fields, and it doesn't have the shape that generates a lot of lift. So you got to fly very cautiously using thermal assistance as you're moving down that ridge. And then once you get down to near Front Royal, you've got that 7 or 8 mile or whatever jump up to the Massanutten, which is then a very nice ridge. But typically on a ridge day, we'd fly the Massanutten, do a lap on that, then jump up and fly the intermediate ridges and thermals back up into the Pennsylvania Ridge System for a flight. And then wrong direction. And then if wave doesn't work and you don't think the High Rock Ridge is what you want to do, then there's always the option of flying cloud streets. And typically those don't start till at least 10 a.m., although I have crossed the valley in cloud streets as early as like 9:30 in the morning. But at 10 o'clock, you can start to kind of expect streets to form up on nice thermal days. And you can fly a street straight upwind to either go into the Tuscarora, the Lewistown Ridge, or keep on the streets up to Bedford or Altoona, and then fly either direction on the main ridge. So those are your 3 options to get out of Fairfield early. Wave, preferable. It doesn't always form. The High Rock Ridge to the south, but it's tricky. Either you wait at High Rock Ridge for thermals to develop, or you land back at Fairfield, have a cup of coffee, and launch again at 10:30, and try the thermal street approach.
Is a street across wave generally continuous, or does it segment?
It normally segments. On a really lucky day, you can have a straight street. Like once I flew from Fairfield to Altoona without turning under one street, 60 miles upwind, but it's only happened for me one time. Usually you got to make jumps, and you kind of follow short streets, and they kind of hang together for a while. Let's talk about late returns to Fairfield. There's kind of 3 ways to do it. One is that you come back from the south. Now you're racing the sun back to the field. You're trying to get down before sundown. If you're coming from the south, again, the High Rock Ridge is a bit tricky, but it does work into the evening. You come up to High Rock, which is what you see right here. From High Rock, if the wind's west-northwest, if you're above the height of the towers, which is about 2,500 feet, say 2,800 feet, it's a pretty comfortable cruise back into Fairfield from 2,800 feet. Not too bad. If you're below 2,800 feet down at tower level or below, it's pretty hairy, and I do not suggest it. There are some tiny landout fields in these valleys heading back toward Jack's Mountain, or rather the ski hill, and Fairfield, but I have not been in them. I would not want to have to land in them, particularly just at sunset. What I typically do is go back and forth in front of High Rock, trying to. I go back and forth in front of Fairfield, or in front of High Rock, trying to get to that 2,800 feet. Often I'll move up the ridge a little bit, closer to the quarry in the hills, try to gain some altitude there. If you can get to 2,500 feet there, then it's a little more comfortable. The hills are shorter to cross, and you come back directly over Fairfield and then into the airport.
I'll just throw out, again, for the guys new to flying these ridges, and in terms of just general ballpark, comfortable kind of criteria, and I think I've even heard the, Streetic and the boys talk about this, but until you're really comfortable with how the conditions are, you don't want to be on the ridge past 4 o'clock. Because after 4 o'clock, your transition is going to be much more difficult. Now, obviously, Bode and Mike and others of us have been on the ridge well after 4 o'clock and still made it back. But until you've done that a few times, 4 o'clock is kind of a good ballpark, time to start working your way back into some altitude and make that transition back across the valley.
I have one more story for you folks, and that was the day 4 of us launched. 2 went north, 2 went south. 2 of us hung at High Rock, while Bode and I think Eric were forced into 5 Lakes. And before Bode landed, I was below the ridge level at High Rock. I asked Bode in the air, I said, so how high can you get back? What's the lowest you've ever come back from High Rock to Fairfield? And he said, oh, you can do it at 2,600 feet, but at 2,400, it's really scary. Since I was at 22, I started looking at the field.
2,600 feet,
it's really scary.
If you can get to 3,000 feet at High Rock, do that, and then it's a pretty comfortable trip back in.
It's really comfortable at 4 and 5 too.
Yeah. If you're coming south down the Tuscarora Lake, like we talked about before, it's often hard to climb late in the day. If you can get to 4,000 or 4,500 feet, you can generally get enough altitude to cross the valley to get back to 5 Lakes Airport, which makes a fine outlanding airport. It's an easy 30-minute drive to go retrieve you. So that's what I typically do is if I can't climb up, I generally do a final glide into 5 Lakes. Very often you can get a little bit of lift over the valley. If so, grab that. You can get high enough in to get into the ridge that's just north of 5 Lakes. It's not a good ridge, but it does generate just a little bit of lift. You can often work that down into the ridges just upwind of Fairfield, and then often catch a late day thermal to come back across.
So when you're working that from 5 Lakes down toward, down south on
the 5 Lakes Ridge.
Yeah, the five Lakes Ridge, you're flying more thermal off ridge as opposed to true ridge flying?
No, we sometimes fly ridge. It's a pretty good ridge, actually. It's not,
it's
it's not high, but it has an okay shape, and there's good landing fields all along there. There's that big.
And then what's your transition then from that point out in the valley to come back to High Rock to cut through the valley? You need to get a thermal there, or can you fly downwind to the High Rock Ridge? I guess it would be west of the quarry at that point.
Well, generally, if you're on the 5 Lakes Ridge, which is right there, you can kind of jump back. There's a little intermediate ridge, and you jump back again, and you're in the hills that are right next to High Rock.
So another way to come home late is to come around that.
Come around that corner and just jump back. You might be able to see it better here. In that, basically, what we're talking about is this ridge right here. That's the 5 Lakes Ridge. You can come down that ridge, jump back to get on this ridge, which is the ridge then closest to Fairfield, which is right here. Then from this ridge, you find a final thermal and then cross the hills back into Fairfield. Of course, the other way is to come back late, is stay out here, find either a great thermal, but if thermals aren't working, look for wave, and then come back at altitude straight in. And you know, from the Tuscarora, it takes about 6,000 feet to glide all the way into Fairfield.
Is that Roxbury where you're turning, or where's that turn upwind?
Up here?
Yeah.
Yeah, typically when we're trying to get back on a tough day, a late day, we're trying to climb near Roxbury because the valley is the shortest there. That puts you directly upwind from Five Lakes. So if everything, nothing else works, you can glide into Five Lakes. And that's what we do.
Interesting.
I think in order of, you only got 20 minutes left. Let me go ahead and jump now to some long distance flying considerations. Does that sound right to the group? If you're planning an 8 or 14-hour flight, which is, you know, what I really enjoy doing. That's why I fly, is to be able to take these big, long flights. It keeps me in the sport. These are the kind of things I think about that you might not necessarily think about if all you do are shorter flights. And, you know, fluid, hydration of food is crucially important. You need to be eating in the cockpit if you're going to be flying for 10 or 12 or 14 hours. And I start eating a couple hours after I started the flight, and then continue to eat every hour throughout the flight to keep fuel in the body. And you gotta drink. I carry 100-ounce Camelback, plus if it's warmer weather, also carry Gatorade bottles too to start with in the cockpit. So I bring a lot of fluid along.
What kind of food are you?
Granola bars, nuts, crackers. I don't think it really matters what you eat, so long as it's, you know, you find it, you know, it's.
But do you ever take sandwiches or anything like that? Cockpit family's food?
I don't take sandwiches, but there's no reason why you shouldn't. I mean, that's fine. You just need something in your stomach to keep fuel. I can't overemphasize the importance of seat comfort and ergonomics. When you're doing an 8 or 10 or 12-hour flight, you've got to be comfortable. If your seat's not comfortable, your glider's not comfortable, figure out why and fix it. Because you just can't fly that long with an uncomfortable glider. You got to be able to pee when you fly, and figure that out and do it comfortably, and figure you're going to be peeing a lot on a long flight. So I personally dump it overboard. Some guys keep it in the cockpit. Whatever works for you, practice doing it. You should be able to pee when you thermal, as well as in turbulent conditions. So like when you're flying the ridge, you're going to have to pee when you're taking these hard, you know, thermal and turbulent hits, and it's not easy to do, so it takes practice.
And when it's cold, you're going to have to pee more.
Yep.
Yeah, and pee freezes. I found that out the hard way. both when dumping it and on the inside of the canopy.
So does your water tube. The drinking water tube will also freeze. I have one that's insulated now.
Right. Some of these are pretty self-explanatory. I'll talk about my emergency bag in a minute. You know, obviously carry a cell phone. When you're taking long flights, do carry a printed road map. That's just so nice if you land out in the mountains somewhere, you don't have cell phone access. At least you can try to figure out where you are and coordinate a retrieve with a road map. And I can't overemphasize the importance of flying with a GPS-coupled DLT and or a spot. I've started flying with a spot this last year, and I can't imagine not flying with it now. So if you're going to try this, please make that investment. And then the last one is a psychological thing. You can't do these long flights without accepting the possibility and embracing the possibility of a long land out and a multi-day retrieve. And that's just part of the adventure. You know, don't stress about it. Just say, hey, that's why we do it. You know, there's nothing wrong with that. Someone somewhere will come and get me. I might not know who that is.
Hopefully with the right That's our commitment to the others within the group that are doing this. And if you come out on a day that there are 3 others or 2 or 1 other that are planning these flights, you have to be prepared that, you know, the wife needs to know that, you know, I might not be back until 2 a.m. because I may not land out, but maybe Mike did, and he's 150 miles from home. And so you have to be part of that group that is willing to go.
The one thing I don't see yet on your list of stuff and preparation, you haven't mentioned oxygen at all. And that should be, to my mind, that's right up there with fluid food. If you're operating all day long at 12 to 14,000 feet.
10,000.
It's true. I mean, I choose not to fly with oxygen for some personal reasons, but If you're up at over, I don't fly at over 14,000 feet except for short periods. And if I did though, I would certainly carry oxygen.
Well, I'm just saying, because for my personal preference, is I'm on oxygen from 10,000 feet. Just as an example, when I was in Utah, field elevation 5,000, I started with oxygen and had it all day long. Now, we were going up to 17,000 feet from time to time.
Yeah, when I say when I wave fly, to me the sweet spot is 8 to 10. That's one of the reasons too, is because below 10 I feel perfectly comfortable without oxygen. Above 10 I start to feel the effects.
Right. And so I know it depends on each individual's physiology, but in context of what you're talking about here, I think that needs to be, I would add that just as, good point. You know, just from you personally. You personally may not need it, but I do and others might.
Sure. This is, I took my emergency bag, and the contents, it varies from time to time, and I dumped it on the table yesterday and photographed it. But this is some of the stuff I carry in the cockpit. There's a couple of flashlights, a small emergency kit, that's a mini hacksaw, it's a portable recharger for my cell phone, spare AA batteries, a multi-tool. What else do I have? A paracord, I can't remember what that is.
Thermal blanket?
Thermal blanket, that's it. A flint for starting fires if I had to spend the night somewhere and all that. So that's typically what I keep in my black bag. I have a strap on it. I keep it in the deck behind my head with a strap over my shoulder in case I find myself hanging upside down in the tree in a cockpit overnight. I can pull it forward and have access to it while I'm waiting for my friends to come and drag me out.
Before you go on, Mike, you know, I carry a down sleeping bag that I stuff in the back that helps keep things from freezing, keeps your battery a little warmer. And you know, if you need it because you're really cold, up at 12,000 feet, you can pull it over your shoulders. And should you end up in the trees or somewhere that you're going to spend the night and it's going to be 0 on the ground, it's not a bad thing to have.
Let's transition now to cold weather flying. We all, you know, we do that often in this club, and it's a wonderful thing because we get sometimes the very best wave and ridge and even thermal conditions in February, January, March. I'm going to talk about 4 items. First is water ballast. We talked about why water ballast is good, and it's good in the winter as well as it is in the summer, but there are some serious considerations to consider about it. That's the next slide. Then we'll also talk about clothing, cockpit procedures, and snow and icing risks. Water ballast. Okay, here are the 3 risks to carrying water in freezing conditions. One is you can't drop it. You know, you're either, the water freezes in the tank, or more likely it freezes in the plumbing that dumps your tanks, and you can't dump the water from your glider. And now you've got a fully loaded glider you're trying to get into an outlanding field, and that can be very, very tricky and dangerous. Second is if you do get freezing either in the tail tank or in the main tanks, it can structurally damage your glider. We all, you know, you remember that water expands when it freezes, and it can crack and delaminate and cause all kinds of nasty bad things. But the third reason is the one I think is most insidious, and why I'm very, very cautious about water and winter flying, is that there is a risk that you can develop a leak in your plumbing, your dump plumbing, and start to slowly leak the water out of your tanks. And what happens then is it will run back along the fuselage, and you can get a giant, basically, icicle, or basically a giant mass of water forming along the back of your tail boom. And what will occur then is your CG will slowly start marching back in flight. If you're cruising along the ridge at 100 knots, you won't notice that right away. You pull up into a thermal and try to thermal with you know, at 50 or 55 knots, and now you've got 75 or 100 pounds of weight back on your tail. You're going to go into a flat spin, uncontrollable CG situation, and that's really bad. And you can't tell that. It's really hard to figure that out if you're,
only
you know,
for a little while.
True. So is that CG risk is what I'm very concerned about. In fact, if you're carrying ballast in the winter, and if you've been up above freezing and you come down into a warmer zone, you got to be cautious too. I maybe even don't dump it if you're landing at Fairfield. Just land with your water to risk the possibility of having it freeze up on your airframe.
Mike, do you use any of the eco-friendly antifreeze?
Well, that's what I was going to talk about right here. That's the next subject. I can't recommend that you use antifreeze when you fly because it, you know, probably violates the manufacturer's recommendations for gliders, but nonetheless, I choose to. I have found that I use windshield washer fluid. Minus 20 F rated windshield washer fluid. You buy jugs for $1.50 to $2 a jug. And I've done tests where if I mix it at, I think, 40% to water, it gives me protection to about -5 or -6 C, which is pretty good. If you mix it 60% with water, it gives you protection to about -8 C. And if I'm expecting to be flying in air that's well below -8 C, which can happen in the winter, then I just choose not to fly with water.
Now, how about polypropylene glycol, the pink stuff we use on boats and motorhomes? No.
You end up dumping it.
Two reasons. One, I tested that, and it doesn't actually work as well as windshield washer fluid. And secondly, that's just nasty stuff to put into the environment. You know, windshield washer fluid is designed to go into the environment.
This is RP, he's talking about.
No, polypropylene glycol.
Oh,
is
poly,
safe.
okay, not,
The pink stuff.
I've not used.
Not ethylene glycol.
Okay, I've not used that, so I can't talk to that.
It's good.
Have you flown with it before?
No. In my boat. You winterize a boat with it, winterize motorhomes with it.
What does that cost per gallon?
It's about $1 or so, depending where you, Walmart.
They sell it in Lowe's and the same place where the windshield washer fluid is.
The other consideration is that if you're using wave to cross these valleys, that temperature differential between the ridge top and the wave top that you're at may be quite substantial in terms of freezing temperatures.
I would suggest that you test the material that you want to fly with before you fly with it. But that might be a perfectly good substitute too. It sounds like it's about twice as expensive as what I use.
I think I tested it at one point when you were doing yours, and this doesn't work as well.
I think I did too. I tested one of the RV antifreezes, and it didn't work as well as at the same mix ratio.
You know, my manual says if it's freezing, don't put anything in your tanks.
Right.
So I concern, and that's all cool, there's these ways and all that, but if your manual says that, and anything were to go wrong, is your insurance going to pick it up because you did something outside the what the manual says? Okay, so
good point.
I'm just saying, you know, I mean.
I can't recommend using antifreeze.
Yeah, okay.
It's an individual decision.
I think another thing
the pilot operation manual.
is know the freezing level before you take off, so the
Yep.
impact on your aviation. Certainly in Europe, where we're legally allowed to fly in clouds, so we will fly up through cloud a lot to get into the wave systems. You get a lot of visible moisture on the glider that can sit in air brakes and things like that.
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about icing here in a minute.
Okay.
Yep. Clothing, layers is good. This is a Bode shot, and Bode really likes layers, more than me. But I find two things are really important when thinking about clothing in winter. Is one, head protection. You lose a lot of heat through your head and your neck, so cover that up. You carry good insulation there. And then secondly, feet. To me, my feet are what always gets cold first. Bode uses these electric boots. I used to fly with electric boots and probably will again, but you can buy electrically heated boots that work pretty well too. Just make sure you have the ability to turn them off in flight. That's real important. Another comment about clothing too, don't overdress when you're rigging your glider because it's easy to break out into a sweat, and then if you sit into the glider when sweaty clothes, you can get chilled very, very quickly. A final thing, or another final thing about clothing is I find I carry a small fleece blanket in the cockpit back behind my head, and I can pull it out, cover up your torso with the blanket, and it allows you in flight to change the amount of insulation you have. If you've got the clothing strapped under your harness and your parachute straps, you're stuck with that for the flight. If conditions change in a flight, you can't change your clothing. But if you have a blanket, you can. So a blanket's a good idea in the cockpit as well. And always remember, you can land out on a winter day, and you have to be prepared to spend a late night in a field. So I always carry an extra thicker jacket back behind me in the fuselage. I call it my Landout coat. That I don't want or need it while I'm flying, but I would certainly need it if I'm at night in February, sitting at the bottom of a ridge somewhere waiting for Paul to come get me.
Look on Bode's face.
Cockpit procedures and practices. If you're going to wear heavy clothing, you haven't practiced with that, sit in the cockpit with your heavy clothing on, your jacket, your gloves, and operate all the controls. That means you got to get up on the cradle and particularly operate the landing gear. I've seen many times where landing gear cannot be brought up, and sometimes because of clothing, landing gear cannot be lowered. because there's just too much clothing. You can't get your arms to move adequately to do that. So practice the controls on the ground. Take off, always take off with your forward canopy vent open. That's one of my takeoff checklist items in cold weather, because I've had that little vent be frozen shut in the morning, and you need that because of internal icing on the canopy. Once you close up the lid, you know, there's enough respiration moisture coming out that you can get a lot of icing on the canopy on the inside and close visibility way down. So make sure that vent is open when you take off.
When John Seymour, just a very quick story, when John Seymour and Streetic, you know, fly out of Eagle Field on a real early morning ridge launch, they used to, they had like a snorkel device. They had like a mouthpiece on the end of a tube. They'd hang it out the window so they'd breathe through this snorkel once they lowered the canopy while they were waiting to launch. Exactly. So they didn't form mist on the inside of the canopy. And then just before launch, they tossed the snorkel out, closed the door, and closed it on launch.
Consummate I've actually discovered I can exhale through my vent window.
Peeing is a problem in the winter because it freezes, so just be aware of that. You can imagine the problems associated with it, so I won't go into any more detail. I put down earplugs because tape, wing tape, frequently fails in cold weather. So if you're out cruising at 100 knots on the ridge or in the wave, expect the tape to get brittle, the adhesive not to work as well. It can come loose, and it makes a hell of a racket. It makes a high-frequency pitch sound that can drive you crazy on a long flight. So you'll be prepared for that. I talked about a blanket. The emergency bag is even more important in cold weather. And then you can't forget about hydration in the winter. It's easy to forget about it because you're not sweating, you don't feel hot, but you lose a tremendous amount of water through respiration in the winter. And you've got to keep drinking in the winter on an 8-hour flight, just like you would in the summer on a 12-hour flight. And then icing on the canopy and on the wings. You've got to be very careful about that. Typically, we do get frost on wings, often on winter mornings before takeoff. And I don't know when frost on wings becomes to a point where it will become a critical safety item, but it makes me very uneasy taking off with frost on wings. And we generally try to scrape it off before we launch. Then once you're flying, ice on canopy and ice on wings is an issue. On the canopy, normally, icing and reduced visibility is because of internal to the canopy. It's the moisture through respiration, and that can be cleared out by opening vents up, which makes it very cold in the cockpit, but it clears your canopy up pretty quick. Occasionally you can get external icing, and here you see a shot by Bode he took. I think he was descending from cold high elevation down through a cloud layer. We can see the clouds up ahead, and he got icing both on the wings and excessive icing on the canopy, external. And he dealt with it, but it was not a good situation. I've never had icing externally to that extent. You know, I occasionally get frost or a little bit of ice on the wings, but not enough like to be a concern. But it did happen to Bode there.
And he said change altitude.
He said, yeah.
It starts to cover over and you can't see anymore. Get out of where you are.
Yeah, go up or down. Typically in a glider, that means going down. But
I have seen ice on planes a number of times, especially if your trailer's been stored inside, you get a really cold night, you bring it out, there's higher humidity, you'll get icing on the wings. Just remember that takeoffs are optional.
One other thing I'd say, Mike, is it sounds like around here we don't spend much time at what I would call high altitude and wave, but if you do in other parts of the world, you can get the glider so super cooled, when you come down, as you said, it'll form ice, and if the freezing level is all the way down to the ground level, that can be a real hazard. So I always know where the freezing level is, know where sources of lift are, so I can come down, park myself there to get rid of all the ice off my airframe and check my controls. And I know some guys that have had to land with the canopy open because with the freezing level all the way to the ground, as they've come down, they just couldn't get rid of the ice. So it's worth knowing that.
Good point.
Bode made a point in an article that he got it on tow, and as he got off tow, he got closer to a cloud, and it formed. He said, get away from the cloud, whatever.
That was probably when this photograph was taken, was that day.
Yeah, that can happen on tow as well.
Yeah, it looked really moist there.
You can see he was up in wave, I believe, or maybe he was in tow, but you can see he was right in the middle of the cloud layer here when it was forming up. The last thing on the agenda is talking a little bit about April 23rd, 2014. You guys want to do that, or you want to just call today?
Go ahead.
Last April was an extraordinary day. Paul Ream and I flew from Fairfield, and this is the OLC trace of the flight. Let me just walk you through it a little bit. We intended to get into wave when we launched. We launched at, here you can see the takeoff was just after 11 Zulu, so it was what, about 7 o'clock or so. We did an initial wave climb. I tried to get into the wave. That didn't work. We dove down and flew down the High Rock Ridge, which is what you see going on right here. Flying down the High Rock Ridge, this is what Dave was pointing to. It's not a real pretty ridge. It's kind of lumpy. You have to make little adjustments here and there. There are landable fields, but you just got to be cautious. But it works. Paul and I flew down the High Rock Ridge. I think Paul got into wave down near Mason-Dixon, I think, or down near Harper's Ferry. I went further down, flew the Blue Ridge down to near Front Royal, which was right here. Got into the wave at this point, and you had a great wave climb, which is what you see right here. Up above, established about 10,000, 11,000 feet. And that was right there, north of Front Royal. Then flew the wave, directly crosswind in the wave, down beyond Massanutten, probably to about 175 miles southwest of Fairfield, over the Shenandoah Valley. And there it blued out, which is often the case with wave. If you get good wave markers up in our area, you go 150, 175, 200 miles south, and they start to blue out. And the reason is just because on northwest days, the wind blows across the Great Lakes, down across Pennsylvania. You get good markers in Pennsylvania. You go down to Virginia, it blues out because the wind now is not, that wind is not blowing across the Great Lakes. It's blowing across Illinois, Indiana. And so now you've got drier conditions and blue conditions further south. So on that day, I chose to turn back to the north and fly the wave up into West Virginia, heading up for Cumberland to fly the main ridge. And that's what these jumps are here, going upwind. In fact, I think I have a slide of that. Now there's a slide showing Massanutten Peak, heading south down the valley from about 10,000 feet, about 5 miles upwind of Massanutten, right over 81.
Was this a weekday?
I think it was.
Yeah, I think it was a Wednesday because we were up at Ridge Soaring that day.
Yeah, you flew from Ridge Soaring that day, you and George. Yeah, and that's passing Massanutten. And then here's working upwind on leg 2. That's typically what you're looking at about halfway through that leg there. You're working lift here. I'm at whatever that is. It looks like about 8,000 feet, 5 knots of wave lift. Slowly climbing, cruising to the north, and then about to make the next dive. You can see the next wave bar up there, right above that cloud.
Is that at Cumberland, Mike, that picture?
No, that picture is taken probably in this area here, just over the Shenandoah Valley, upwind.
Cumberland was overcast that day.
Yeah. I'll show you some photographs of that in just a second.
It almost looks like SHD there off your right, your right corner.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite shots. I mean, this is actually a collection of 5 photographs that I stitched them together to make this panorama. And it's taken just downwind from Petersburg. This is in the secondary wave, taken right about there. And cruising 10,000, 11,000 feet, about to make a hard left turn to go diving up into the primary wave, which is right up in this zone. And Petersburg is right under the left wing. Cumberland is about 50 miles straight ahead. But it was just an extraordinary day to fly the wave upwind and get to Cumberland. My intent was to get to Cumberland, go down the ridge, and fly to Williamsport, and then turn and fly the main ridge back south. But once I got to Cumberland, it was total solid deck all over Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And you were underneath that deck. I was on top of the deck.
I was underneath it trying to get on top.
And I didn't want to go on top. I didn't want to go underneath, so I turned back south and decided to fly the main ridge southbound, see how far I could go. I was able to stay in wave lift down to about Petersburg, and then a solid deck there forced me down. I dived down onto the ridge, flew the main ridge down to Mountain Grove.
Do you have a picture of Snowy Mountain transition by chance?
Not in this presentation. There's flying the main ridge down. I think Snowy Mountain is just behind the glider at this point. Seneca Rock is just ahead. This is the section between Snowy Mountain and Seneca Rock.
So can we talk about Snowy Mountain a minute?
Yeah.
Because Knopf's books always talks about you're northbound. I gather southbound is not a big deal because you're higher going to lower, and Snowy Mountain's upwind, so you can blast across. But northbound, Knopf's book always talks about climbing at the south end of the gap to some altitude to cross, and some altitude is generally higher because I guess Snowy Mountain sets up a terrible amount of turbulence coming through that gap. Then I discovered, I guess George told me that he saw guys going upwind, leaving the main ridge, going upwind of Snowy Mountain and then back down the main ridge. Can you talk about those two options?
Well, he's talking about this zone right there. That's Snowy Mountain, the gap. That's the transition. And it's a tricky transition on the main ridge because Snowy Mountain's almost 5,000 feet high.
Right.
It's a huge mountain. It's like the highest point on the main ridge in this section of it. And there's a little upwind mountain there that you can either go ahead of or behind it. I typically go behind it, and I've never had trouble. I think some people jump up ahead of that little mountain and cross it that way.
Yeah, but there was evidently, if you don't do it correctly, going northbound, you can get into trouble and go up that. There's a small ridge, I guess, that leads from the upwind side of Snowy Mountain towards the north. That's not the main Eagle Ridge. That's very much lower, and you can get in trouble if you're not careful. That's why I was trying to get.
It must be the ridge here.
Oh, the one that leads into Cherry Grove.
I don't know. That's a transition that I think George was following at that point. Carl and Seymour, and they did their normal. We're not going to turn for however many hundreds of miles we're going to fly today, and they did something magic. And George tried to follow them, but went on the wrong ridge then, on the north side of Snowy Mountain.
It's a tricky area right there, and the key is if you see an area you're uncomfortable with when you're flying the main ridge, you simply stop thermal, and assess, gain some altitude.
And you've not had trouble at the south end of that gap getting high enough to cross downwind of Snowy Mountain?
I've never had trouble there.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
That's flying north, Snowy Mountain behind, Seneca Rock ahead. And that's typical of the main ridge. That's typically what you're looking at in terms of ridge. There's a few landable fields in this valley, not many, but enough. Now back at Petersburg, the wave formed up very nicely right there. I was able to climb up under the cloud and then do this wave, this initial wave climb right in front of the cloud in the main wave gap. Then you see 10 knots on the Vario, cruising at 55 knots northbound as I'm climbing up past the cloud. And then the next shot is one of my favorite shots, and that is cruising between Petersburg and Cumberland along the primary wave gap at 100 knots and climbing between 10 to 12,000 feet, right in here. And it's just amazing. Basically, that's the primary wave gap. This is the secondary wave gap, and it goes as far as the eye can see. Just a 2-lane superhighway for gliders. And so that was a thrill. I mean, that's nirvana for a glider pilot. Anyway, I flew the main wave up to Cumberland. There is, again, all of Pennsylvania was pretty much covered, particularly the front ridge was completely covered in cloud. I could not go any farther north. So I started dropping back and seeing holes, which allowed me to stay in the wave and fly the wave up to Mifflin, which was right in this zone. Once I got to Mifflin, this is basically what you had over the bow. It was just solid, again, solid deck, no clouds. Whoops. No clouds, holes to speak of, and you obviously can't just wander out across that in a glider. That's just no good. So basically at that point turned south again and flew the wave back into the Shenandoah Valley. And on that day in that area we had double stacked lenticulars, which was very unusual for us. Occasionally you get linnies up above the wave clouds.
I tried to get into those that day, Mike, and I could not.
Well,
but they were up above 16,000 feet.
Yeah, well here I'm at about 12 or 14 here. This was taken right in this zone right here, and in front of one linny, and there's another linny right below. So it was a double linny stack flying right in front of it, which was really neat. And so I flew that back down to almost Front Royal, staying in the wave, and then made the final run into Fairfield using wave, then ridge, and then a little thermal to get back to the airfield before sunset. And it was a 1,341 kilometer flight with about 1,000 kilometers in wave. Just really a great day. A lot of fun. And I think that's the last slide. Any questions?
What's your goal this year? Become a flight instructor.
Oh, I'd like to do a 1,500 kilometer badge flight, and I'd also like to do, which will probably require starting from Mifflin, and then do a 1,000K FAI triangle out of Fairfield.
Mike, I took a couple of notes that I'd like to read through because I have the lights on. Well, one is that on a lot of days when you're trying to make these transitions and it's a blue day, you have to be thinking that these cloud streets that were there on the windy day that you can see these thermals are also still there on the days that you can't see the thermals. So making transitions upwind especially should be done when you find that cloud street. So even if you can't see it, the fact that you found a thermal a mile from your transition point means that the best way to get upwind is to turn up and search for that street before you turn parallel. That was the first thing I wanted to say. We got that one. Yes, when you're near, when you are close to ridge level and you're thinking about thermaling in places like Petersburg, in that gap there, that's a very violent area. And if you think that you're going to do your thermaling like you've been taught at home, which is 2 knots above stall speed, and you're only 300 feet above the ridge, you can lose 20, 30 knots of airspeed with any particular gust. So you need to have extra airspeed thermaling close to those ridges in and around those gaps. In fact, probably anywhere on the ridge when you're low.
Paul, can I just say one thing? I have very little experience flying these ridges, but in the other areas of the world I've flown, one of the big risks is false horizons, because you're turning at low level. Yes. And the speed differential when you're flying downwind, you suddenly get towards a ridge. You get this huge speed sensation with the ridge coming up above you, yes. So you're wanting to raise the nose. Yes. That's one of the most dangerous situations you can get in, so just be prepared for that.
We had a flight, Jeff and I had the Grove at Petersburg, I don't know, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, and I'm trying to teach him how to thermal up into the wave, and he's getting it, but he's not quite there. And you know, you're not going to do your standard thermaling. You're going to be changing speeds, pulling up, slowing down, and we were down close to the ridge, and no sooner did the words come out of my mouth, hey Jeff, let's speed up here about 10 or 15 knots, when all of a sudden we got hit with a gust and we lost 20 knots of airspeed, 500 feet above the ridge. Now, is that a problem? Maybe not. Maybe. Let's see, the other thing I didn't hear anyone talk about was that when you're on a ridge and you're getting low and you think you found a thermal, but it's weak, you have to constantly judge how far you're drifting and how much altitude you're actually gaining. Your Vario may be making all sorts of noise, but you're not climbing. All you're really doing is drifting downwind from the ridge, and if your plan is not this valley, but this one, you have to be cognizant of your energy state with relation to that ridge. That's another note I had. Yeah, wave suppression. I look at wave as, you know, it's drawn on everybody's chart as this very laminar flowing thing, but depending on the shape of the ridges upwind of you, you could have one spot that dips down in like a bowl, and in another place right next to it, it's not there. So it's highly, especially as you're low in it, it's very sensitive about where you find it. See, you guys already went over the splash effect. I've been caught several times in cloud, and I don't scare easy, but I can tell you that my knees were knocking the fuselage before it was all over, and I had all kinds of altitude. And you should think really hard about your decision to fly on days that have high moisture content, because that's typically when this happens, that beginners get caught in cloud. And getting in cloud was described to me by my instructor at the time as your lifespan is about 45 seconds, even at 12,000 feet. Because once you put that plane over red line, or it begins to flutter because of what's happening to you, or the damage starts to happen and the plane starts coming apart, it's too late.
Well, let me interject. One of the things you should know is read your pilot handbook about your particular glider that you're flying. Can you do a 100-knot dive with full dive brakes? Can you go V&E with full dive brakes? Because one of the tricks is V&E, full dive brakes, and gear down if your airplane manual says that's A-OK.
And thank you, Mike. Really good show.
Mike, can we put the chairs back?
Yes,
Yeah,
sir.
we'd like to have a few volunteers to help with tables and chairs.
Our agreement here is with the fire department.